Hello everyone, welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's stories. Tonight, I am going to tell you a story that began on a quiet summer day in Tallahassee, Florida, and ended nearly 2 years later in the charred remains of a Georgia plantation after a prescribed burn cleared away the secrets hidden beneath heavy brush. It's the story of 12-year-old Lori Annalise Page, a young girl whose disappearance would captivate a community, involve the FBI, and ultimately reveal a heartbreaking truth that no one wanted to believe. This is a story about digital breadcrumbs left behind by a killer, about internet searches for remote areas with bodies of water, about DNA evidence found in a father's car, and about the relentless pursuit of justice that would span 22 months. It's a story that reminds us that in the digital age, our devices can become the very instruments that reveal our darkest secrets. The case of Lori Page is particularly haunting because it involves the ultimate betrayal, a father who not only took his daughter's life but then orchestrated an elaborate deception, pretending to search for her while knowing exactly where her body lay hidden. For nearly 2 years, Andrew Wiley played the role of the grieving father, participating in searches, pleading with the media, all while harboring the terrible secret that he had killed his own child. So settle in, close your eyes, and let me take you through every twist and turn of this tragic case, from the initial missing person report to the digital forensics that would ultimately expose a killer's lies, from the community's hope to their devastating heartbreak, from the methodical police work to the moment when advanced technology would finally reveal the truth. It was a hot Saturday in early June when the call came into the Tallahassee Police Department. The temperature was already climbing toward 90 degrees, and the summer humidity that characterizes North Florida was settling over the city like a heavy blanket. In the Continental Court neighborhood, a quiet residential area where modest homes sit on tree-lined streets and children still play outside, Andrew Wiley was about to make a phone call that would change everything. At 36 years old, Andrew Wiley was the sole custodian of his 12-year-old daughter, Lori Annalise Page. Their relationship was complicated, their living situation was troubled, and their story was about to become one of the most heartbreaking cases in Tallahassee's recent memory. When Wiley called the police that Saturday, he told them his daughter had simply vanished. According to his initial statement, Lori had left their home on Continental Court sometime during the night while he was at work. She had taken her backpack, he said, and she hadn't returned. He painted a picture of a troubled girl who might have run away, a child who had been unhappy and might have made an impulsive decision to leave. But even in those first few hours, something about Andrew Wiley's story didn't quite add up. The Tallahassee Police Department treats every missing child case as an emergency. Within hours of Wiley's call, Continental Court was transformed into a hub of activity. Police cruisers lined the narrow residential street, their blue and red lights reflecting off the windows of nearby homes. Officers went door to door, knocking on every door in the neighborhood, asking residents if they had seen Lori, if they knew anything about where she might have gone. Detective teams began the methodical process of building a timeline. When had Lori last been seen? What had she been wearing? Did she have any money? Did she have friends she might have gone to stay with? Where did she like to spend time? But as investigators began asking these fundamental questions, they encountered an unusual problem. Lori Page was virtually invisible in the modern world. She didn't have a cell phone, unusual for a 12-year-old in 2023. She wasn't on social media platforms like Instagram, TikTok, or Snapchat. She didn't have online friends or digital connections that could be traced. In an age where most children leave digital footprints everywhere they go, Lori had left no trail to follow. The Continental Court neighborhood is the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where children ride bicycles in the street and adults wave to each other from their front porches. It's a community where a missing child should have been noticed, where someone should have seen something. But as police canvassed the area, they found surprisingly few people who could provide detailed information about Lori's movements in the days leading up to her disappearance. Some neighbors recognized her as a quiet girl who kept to herself. Others said they rarely saw her playing with other children or spending time outside. This isolation would prove significant as the investigation progressed. Lori wasn't just missing, she had been living in a kind of social isolation that made her disappearance harder to investigate and, as it would later become clear, made her more vulnerable to the person who would ultimately harm her. By Sunday morning, less than 24 hours after Wiley's initial report, the search for Lori Page was in full swing. The Tallahassee Police Department organized search teams that would comb through every inch of the surrounding area. They started with the immediate neighborhood, searching vacant lots, wooded areas, abandoned buildings, and any place a 12-year-old might seek shelter. The searches were methodical and thorough. Officers walked in grid patterns, calling Lori's name, looking for any sign, a piece of clothing, a backpack, footprints, anything that might indicate where she had gone. Volunteers from the community joined the effort, adding their voices to the chorus calling for Lori to come home. They searched Cascades Park, one of Tallahassee's most popular recreational areas, with its walking trails, playground equipment, and open spaces where children often played. They searched the areas around local schools, including Griffin Middle School where Lori was enrolled. They searched shopping centers, bus stops, and anywhere a child might go if they were trying to run away or find help. Throughout these early days of the search, Andrew Wiley remained cooperative with police. He participated in searches, walking through neighborhoods and wooded areas, calling his daughter's name along with everyone else. He spoke to local media outlets, appearing on television news programs to plead for his daughter's safe return. In these interviews, Wiley presented himself as a concerned father doing everything possible to find his missing child. He described Lori as a troubled girl who had been unhappy living with him. He suggested that she might have run away to try to find her mother, though he was vague about the mother's whereabouts or involvement in Lori's life. Wiley told investigators that he had been at work on the night Lori disappeared. He worked late hours, he explained, and often came home to find Lori already asleep. On this particular night, he said, he had come home to find that she wasn't there. Her bed hadn't been slept in, and some of her belongings, including her backpack, were missing. But even as Wiley was telling this story to police and to the media, investigators were beginning to notice small inconsistencies. Details that didn't quite match up from one telling to the next. Timelines that seemed unclear. Explanations that raised more questions than they answered. News of Lori's disappearance spread quickly through Tallahassee. Social media posts shared her photo and description. Local news stations featured her story prominently. Missing person flyers were distributed throughout the city and beyond. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Volunteers organized search parties that continued long after the official police searches had ended for the day. Local businesses donated food and water for search teams. Churches held prayer services for Lori's safe return. But as days turned into weeks with no sign of Lori, the initial surge of hope began to give way to a more sobering reality. The statistical truth about missing children is harsh: the longer they're gone, the less likely they are to be found alive. Everyone involved in the search knew this, but no one wanted to voice it out loud. In those first crucial weeks after Lori's disappearance, the Tallahassee Police Department pursued every possible lead with the urgency that missing child cases demand. Detectives worked around the clock, following up on tips, interviewing potential witnesses, and trying to piece together the puzzle of where a 12-year-old girl could have gone. The investigation expanded beyond Tallahassee as detectives pursued leads across state lines. They contacted law enforcement agencies in neighboring states, distributed Lori's information through national databases, and coordinated with federal authorities who specialize in missing children cases. But with each passing day, the leads grew colder. Tips came in regularly. People thought they had seen Lori at a gas station, at a shopping mall, walking along a highway, but when investigators followed up, these sightings never panned out. The girl people thought they had seen was always someone else, or the timeline didn't match, or the description was wrong. By late summer 2023, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had become involved in the Lori Page case. The FBI's involvement in local missing person cases typically indicates one of several possibilities: the case may involve interstate crime, federal laws may have been violated, or local authorities have requested federal resources and expertise. FBI agents brought advanced analytical capabilities to the investigation. They had access to national databases, sophisticated forensic techniques, and behavioral analysis experts who could provide insights into what might have happened to Lori. The FBI also brought something else crucial to the case: a reward. They offered up to $15,000 for information leading to Lori's recovery. This reward would remain in place throughout the investigation, a constant reminder that the search for Lori was ongoing and that anyone with information could make a difference. As the investigation progressed through the summer and fall of 2023, detectives began to focus more intensively on Andrew Wiley himself. This shift in focus wasn't unusual. In missing person cases, especially those involving children, investigators always look closely at family members and those with close access to the victim. What was unusual was what investigators were beginning to discover about Andrew Wiley's behavior and statements. The inconsistencies that had been noticed in the early days of the investigation were becoming more pronounced as detectives re-interviewed him and compared his various statements. Wiley's story about the night Lori disappeared contained several elements that didn't quite make sense. His timeline was vague. His description of Lori's state of mind seemed to change from one interview to the next. His explanations for why she might have run away became more elaborate but less convincing over time. On February 2, 2024, nearly 8 months after Lori's disappearance, investigators took a step that would prove crucial to solving the case. They seized a phone from Andrew Wiley's residence and subjected it to forensic analysis. Digital forensics has revolutionized criminal investigations in the 21st century. Our phones, computers, and other electronic devices maintain detailed records of our activities, our searches, our communications, and our locations. They create digital footprints that can be analyzed long after the fact to reveal patterns of behavior, intent, and sometimes guilt. The forensic analysis of Wiley's phone revealed something deeply disturbing: questionable internet searches about remote areas with bodies of water in Alabama and Georgia, among other things. These weren't casual searches or research for a vacation. These were specific, targeted searches for isolated locations where someone might dispose of a body. The discovery of these internet searches changed everything about the Lori Page investigation. Suddenly, this wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It was a homicide investigation. The digital evidence from Wiley's phone didn't just reveal suspicious internet searches, it actually pinpointed detectives to a specific location, Merrily Plantation in Thomas County, Georgia. This remote location, about an hour's drive from Tallahassee, became the focus of an intensive search effort. Merrily Plantation isn't a working plantation in the traditional sense. Like many properties in rural Georgia that still carry the plantation designation, it consists of large tracts of undeveloped land, much of it heavily forested and difficult to access. It's exactly the kind of remote, isolated area that someone might choose if they were trying to hide something, or someone. But searching such a vast, overgrown area presented enormous challenges. The terrain was difficult, the vegetation was thick, and the area was so large that it would take extensive resources and time to search thoroughly. In March 2024, nearly 9 months after Lori's disappearance, police officially identified Andrew Wiley as the focus of their investigation. This shift came after they had identified more inconsistencies in his statements and uncovered new information about his relationship with Lori. This was the moment when the investigation transformed from a search for a missing child to the building of a murder case against her father. But this transformation had to happen carefully and quietly. Wiley couldn't know that he was now the primary suspect, or he might flee or destroy additional evidence. So while the public continued to see Andrew Wiley as the grieving father of a missing child, investigators were quietly building the case that would eventually put him behind bars for murder. This required incredible discipline and secrecy from everyone involved in the investigation. Throughout 2024, investigators continued to gather evidence against Andrew Wiley. The internet searches on his phone were just the beginning. Digital forensics experts continued to analyze his electronic devices, looking for additional evidence of planning, intent, or attempts to cover up a crime. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence that would eventually be revealed was DNA evidence showing that Lori had been bleeding in Wiley's car. This physical evidence corroborated the investigators' growing belief that Wiley had killed his daughter and transported her body to dispose of it. Additionally, investigators discovered that Wiley had destroyed his electronics and was taking steps to flee the continental United States. This evidence of consciousness of guilt, the legal term for behavior that suggests someone knows they've committed a crime, was crucial to the case being built against him. The breakthrough that would finally lead to the discovery of Lori's remains came in early 2024, when the heavily forested area of Merrily Plantation underwent a prescribed burn that cleared heavy brush. Prescribed burns are controlled fires used to manage forest growth and reduce the risk of wildfires. They're common in the southeastern United States and are typically conducted by forestry professionals. Multiple searches of the area in early 2024 had yielded no findings until this prescribed burn cleared the heavy vegetation that had been concealing what lay beneath. It was only after the burn had removed the thick underbrush that searchers were finally able to locate what they had been looking for. Nearly 2 years after 12-year-old Lori Page was reported missing, on April 5, 2025, searchers made the discovery that everyone had hoped they would never have to make. In the now cleared woodland area of Merrily Plantation in Thomas County, Georgia, human remains were found. The location was exactly where digital forensics had suggested they would be found. The internet searches on Andrew Wiley's phone, the analysis of his digital activities, the painstaking investigation that had taken nearly 2 years, it had all led to this moment. The remains were found in a remote, heavily wooded area that would have been nearly impossible to search thoroughly before the prescribed burn cleared away the concealing vegetation. It was a location that spoke to careful planning and deliberate concealment, not the random disposal site that might result from a crime of passion, but the calculated choice of someone who had thought carefully about where to hide evidence of their crime. The remains were immediately transported to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for processing and identification. Modern forensic science has made the identification of human remains much more precise and reliable than it was even a generation ago, but it still requires time and careful analysis. Forensic anthropologists would examine the remains to determine age, sex, and any evidence of trauma. Dental records would be compared if possible. DNA analysis would provide the most definitive identification. Each of these processes requires time, expertise, and careful documentation to ensure that the results would stand up in court. During this period, the community held its breath. Everyone hoped against hope that these remains wouldn't be Lori's, that somehow this discovery would be unrelated to her case, that there might still be a chance she was alive somewhere. On April 11, 2025, nearly 2 years to the day after Lori Page was reported missing, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement confirmed what everyone feared: the remains found in Thomas County, Georgia, were those of 12-year-old Lori Annalise Page. The confirmation of Lori's identity marked the end of one phase of the case and the beginning of another. The search for a missing child was over. The prosecution of her killer was about to begin. Hours after the identification was confirmed, Tallahassee Police Department Chief Lawrence Revelle called a press conference that would shock the community and vindicate nearly 2 years of painstaking investigation work. Andrew Wiley, the man who had reported his daughter missing, the man who had participated in searches for her, the man who had pleaded with the media for her safe return, had been arrested and charged with second-degree murder in connection with Lori's death. The arrest represented the culmination of one of the most complex and challenging investigations in the Tallahassee Police Department's recent history. It involved digital forensics, interstate cooperation, federal resources, and the kind of methodical detective work that builds cases one piece of evidence at a time. With Andrew Wiley's arrest, investigators were finally able to reveal the timeline they had constructed through their investigation. The story they told was far different from the one Wiley had been presenting for nearly 2 years. According to the evidence gathered during the investigation, investigators believed that Wiley had killed his daughter on June 1, 2023, 2 days before he reported her missing. On June 2, 2023, they believed, Wiley had driven to Thomas County, Georgia, and disposed of Lori's body in the remote wooded area where she would eventually be found. Then, on June 3, 2023, he had called police to report her missing. This timeline explained all the inconsistencies that investigators had noticed from the very beginning. Wiley's story had never quite made sense because he was trying to cover up a murder with a missing person report. He was trying to create the illusion that Lori had run away when he knew exactly where her body was located. Perhaps most chilling of all was the evidence that suggested Wiley had prepared for what would happen after he killed his daughter. According to court records, on June 2, 2023, the same day investigators believed he disposed of Lori's body, Wiley took preparations to flee the country. This evidence of advanced planning suggested that Wiley's crime wasn't a moment of rage or a tragic accident. It was a calculated act followed by careful planning to avoid the consequences. He had killed his daughter, disposed of her body, prepared to flee the country, and then reported her missing, all as part of what appeared to be a premeditated plan. The digital evidence that had led investigators to Merrily Plantation was even more extensive than initially revealed. Wiley's internet searches hadn't just been about remote areas with bodies of water, they had been specifically focused on locations in Alabama and Georgia, and the forensic analysis had been detailed enough to pinpoint investigators to the exact area where Lori's remains would eventually be found. This level of digital evidence is characteristic of modern criminal investigations. Our electronic devices create detailed records of our activities, and forensic analysts have become increasingly sophisticated in their ability to extract and interpret this data. In Wiley's case, his own internet searches became the roadmap that led investigators directly to his daughter's body. Beyond the digital evidence, investigators had also gathered physical evidence that supported their case. DNA evidence showed that Lori had been bleeding in Wiley's car, providing physical proof that she had been in the vehicle and that violence had occurred. This combination of digital and physical evidence created a compelling case against Andrew Wiley. The internet searches showed planning and intent. The DNA evidence in his car showed that Lori had been injured and that he had transported her. The location of her remains matched the areas he had been researching online. Andrew Wiley was charged with second-degree murder in connection with Lori's death. In Florida, second-degree murder is defined as the unlawful killing of a human being when committed by a person engaged in a perpetration of, or in an attempt to perpetrate, any dangerous felony, or when committed by a person evincing a depraved mind regardless of human life. The charge of second-degree murder, rather than first-degree murder, suggests that while prosecutors believed Wiley had killed his daughter intentionally, they may not have been able to prove the level of premeditation required for a first-degree murder charge. However, second-degree murder still carries severe penalties, including the possibility of life in prison. As more details of the case became public, court records began to reveal evidence of what prosecutors described as likely abuse of Lori occurring before her death. This evidence painted a disturbing picture of Lori's final months and possibly years. The revelation that Lori had likely been abused before her murder makes her story even more tragic. She was a vulnerable child who should have been protected by the person who ultimately killed her. The abuse allegations suggest that her murder may have been the culmination of ongoing violence rather than an isolated incident. This pattern of abuse also helps explain some of the concerning details about Lori's life that had emerged during the investigation. Her isolation from peers, her lack of digital presence, her limited social connections, all of these factors may have been the result of an abusive environment that kept her isolated and vulnerable. One of the most damaging aspects of the case against Andrew Wiley was evidence that he had destroyed his electronics after Lori's death. The destruction of potential evidence is a serious crime in itself and strongly suggests consciousness of guilt. In the digital age, the destruction of electronic devices is particularly significant because these devices often contain the most detailed evidence of a person's activities, communications, and intent. The fact that Wiley had destroyed this evidence suggested that he knew it contained information that would be damaging to him. However, investigators had been able to recover significant digital evidence despite Wiley's attempts to destroy it. Modern digital forensics techniques can often recover data even from devices that have been deliberately damaged or wiped, and in this case, they had recovered enough information to build a strong case. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the evidence against Andrew Wiley was the indication that he had been taking steps to flee the continental United States. This evidence suggested that he had been planning for the possibility that he would eventually be caught and had been preparing to escape prosecution. The preparation to flee the country is significant for several reasons. First, it shows consciousness of guilt, an awareness that he had committed a crime and would face consequences if caught. Second, it demonstrates the calculated nature of his actions. This wasn't someone who had committed a crime in a moment of passion and then panicked. This was someone who had planned ahead for the possibility of being discovered. At his first court appearance, a judge ordered Andrew Wiley held without bond. This decision was based both on the severity of the charges against him and on the evidence that he had previously prepared to flee the country. The risk that he might attempt to escape prosecution was considered too high to allow him to be released on bail. The legal process in murder cases is typically lengthy and complex. Prosecutors must present their evidence methodically, ensuring that every piece is properly documented and that the chain of custody is maintained. Defense attorneys will challenge every aspect of the prosecution's case, looking for weaknesses in the evidence or procedural errors that might benefit their client. The revelation that Andrew Wiley had been charged with murdering his own daughter sent shockwaves through the Tallahassee community. People who had participated in searches for Lori, who had prayed for her safe return, who had sympathized with Andrew Wiley as a grieving father, now had to grapple with the reality that he had been deceiving them all along. The betrayal felt by the community was profound. Volunteers who had spent hours searching for Lori, law enforcement officers who had worked tirelessly on the case, neighbors who had supported the family during the search, all of them had to come to terms with the fact that they had been manipulated by someone who knew exactly what had happened to his daughter. Chief Lawrence Revelle spoke for the entire community when he described the case as having deeply impacted our community for nearly 2 years. The impact wasn't just the tragedy of a child's death, but the additional trauma of learning that the person they had trusted and supported had been responsible for that death all along. Despite the tragic outcome, the Lori Page investigation represented a significant success for law enforcement. The case demonstrated the power of modern investigative techniques, particularly digital forensics, to uncover evidence and build strong cases even in the most challenging circumstances. The cooperation between local, state, and federal authorities had been exemplary. The Tallahassee Police Department, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, the FBI, and the Thomas County Sheriff's Office in Georgia had all worked together seamlessly to solve the case. The investigation also demonstrated the importance of persistence and methodical detective work. The case wasn't solved by a single breakthrough or a dramatic confession. It was solved by the patient accumulation of evidence, the careful analysis of digital data, and the willingness of investigators to follow leads wherever they took them. The case of Lori Page raises important questions about the systems designed to protect vulnerable children. Lori had been in the custody of the Department of Children and Families before coming to live with her father. This history suggests that she had already been identified as a child at risk, yet the system had ultimately failed to protect her. The details that emerged about Lori's living situation, being left alone for hours at a time with no supervision, living in isolation from peers, being kept away from normal childhood activities, all suggest that there may have been warning signs that were either missed or not properly addressed. Child protection is one of society's most challenging responsibilities. Social workers and other professionals must make difficult decisions about when to remove children from their homes, when to place them with relatives, and how to monitor their safety over time. The system is imperfect, and cases like Lori's highlight the tragic consequences when that system fails. The Lori Page case is also a compelling example of how technology has transformed modern criminal investigations. The digital evidence that ultimately led to Andrew Wiley's arrest and to the discovery of Lori's remains would not have existed a generation ago. Internet search histories, GPS data, cell phone records, digital communications, all of these forms of evidence have become crucial tools in modern law enforcement. They can provide investigators with detailed timelines of a suspect's activities, evidence of planning and intent, and even specific locations where crimes may have been committed. However, the case also demonstrates that technology is only as good as the investigators who use it. The digital evidence in Wiley's phone didn't automatically solve the case. It required skilled forensic analysts to extract and interpret the data, experienced detectives to understand its significance, and persistent investigators to follow where the evidence led. The Lori Page case had a profound impact on the Tallahassee community that extended far beyond the immediate family. When a child goes missing, the entire community is affected. Neighbors become more protective of their own children. Parents become more vigilant about safety. The sense of security that comes from living in a safe community is shaken. But the revelation that Lori's own father had killed her added an additional layer of trauma. It challenged fundamental assumptions about family, about trust, about the people we rely on to protect children. It forced the community to confront the reality that sometimes the greatest danger to a child comes from within their own home. The volunteers who had searched for Lori, the community members who had supported the family, the neighbors who had hoped and prayed for her safe return, all of them had to process not just the grief of losing a child, but the betrayal of being deceived by someone they had trusted and tried to help. The successful resolution of the Lori Page case provides several important lessons for law enforcement agencies dealing with similar cases. First, it demonstrates the importance of not giving up on cold cases. Even when leads dry up and months pass without progress, continuing to work the case can eventually lead to breakthroughs. Second, it shows the value of interagency cooperation. The case involved multiple jurisdictions, Florida and Georgia, and multiple levels of law enforcement, local, state, and federal. The successful coordination between these agencies was crucial to solving the case. Third, it highlights the importance of digital forensics in modern investigations. The ability to extract and analyze data from electronic devices has become one of the most powerful tools available to investigators, and agencies that invest in these capabilities are better equipped to solve complex cases. As this story is being told, Andrew Wiley's case is still making its way through the legal system. He has been charged with second-degree murder, but he has not yet been convicted. The legal process will likely take months or even years to complete, involving pre-trial motions, plea negotiations, and possibly a trial. Prosecutors will need to present their evidence to a jury and prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Andrew Wiley killed his daughter. Defense attorneys will challenge that evidence and may present alternative theories about what happened to Lori. The judicial process, while sometimes lengthy and complex, is designed to ensure that justice is served fairly and thoroughly. In cases like this, it's important not to let the legal proceedings and the focus on the perpetrator overshadow the memory of the victim. Lori Annalise Page was 12 years old when her life was taken. She was a student at Griffin Middle School, a quiet girl who deserved the chance to grow up, to make friends, to discover her interests and talents, to live a full life. The tragedy of Lori's death isn't just that a crime was committed, but that a life full of potential was cut short. She will never have the chance to go to high school, to graduate, to go to college, to have a career, to fall in love, to have a family of her own. All of those possibilities died with her in June 2023. The case of Lori Page is a story of betrayal, deception, and ultimately justice. It's a story that reminds us that evil sometimes wears the most familiar faces, that the people we trust most can sometimes be the ones who hurt us most deeply. For nearly 2 years, Andrew Wiley successfully deceived an entire community. He played the role of the grieving father while knowing that he had killed his own daughter. He participated in searches for her while knowing exactly where her body lay hidden. He pleaded with the media for her safe return while knowing that she would never return home. But the case is also a story of the triumph of modern investigative techniques and the dedication of law enforcement professionals who refuse to give up. Digital forensics revealed the truth that Andrew Wiley had tried so hard to hide. Patient detective work built the case that would eventually bring him to justice. Interagency cooperation ensured that no stone was left unturned in the search for answers. The community that was so deeply affected by Lori's disappearance and the revelation of her father's guilt has begun the difficult process of healing. They have mourned the loss of a 12-year-old girl whose life was cut tragically short. They have processed the betrayal of someone they trusted and tried to help. And they have found some measure of closure in knowing that the person responsible for Lori's death has been brought to justice. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Lori Annalise Page not as a victim of crime, but as a child who deserved better than the life she was given and the death she suffered. Remember her as a 12-year-old girl with hopes and dreams, fears and wishes, just like any other child. The digital breadcrumbs left behind by her killer, the internet searches for remote locations, the GPS data that led investigators across state lines, the DNA evidence found in his car, these technological traces became the voice that Lori could no longer use to tell her own story. In a way, the very devices that Andrew Wiley used to plan and cover up his crime became the instruments of justice that would ultimately expose his guilt. This case reminds us that in our modern world, privacy is increasingly rare and deception is increasingly difficult to maintain. Our phones, our computers, our digital lives create permanent records of our actions and intentions. For those who seek to harm others, this reality means that evidence of their crimes may be preserved in ways they never anticipated. But technology alone didn't solve this case. It was the combination of advanced forensic techniques with old-fashioned detective work, the careful building of timelines, the patient interviewing of witnesses, the methodical collection and analysis of evidence, that ultimately brought Andrew Wiley to justice. The prescribed burn that cleared the heavy brush from Merrily Plantation and finally revealed Lori's remains was, in a way, symbolic of the entire investigation. Just as the controlled fire cleared away the vegetation that had been concealing the truth, the patient work of investigators gradually burned away the lies and deception that Andrew Wiley had constructed around his daughter's disappearance. The community of Tallahassee, which had rallied around what they believed was a grieving father, learned a difficult lesson about trust and deception. But they also demonstrated something beautiful about human nature, the willingness to come together in times of crisis, to search for a missing child, to hope against hope for a positive outcome. The volunteers who spent countless hours searching for Lori, the law enforcement officers who worked the case for nearly 2 years, the forensic experts who analyzed digital evidence and DNA samples, all of them were part of a collective effort to find the truth and seek justice for a little girl who could no longer speak for herself. In the end, justice for Lori Page came not from a dramatic confession or a surprise witness, but from the methodical application of modern investigative techniques and the refusal of dedicated professionals to give up on a case that seemed to have no answers. The legal process will continue. Andrew Wiley will face trial, and a jury will ultimately decide his fate. But regardless of what happens in the courtroom, the truth about what happened to Lori Page has finally been revealed. The 22 months of searching, investigating, and hoping have come to an end. Tonight, as you close your eyes and let sleep take you, remember that justice, while sometimes slow, can still prevail. Remember that even in our darkest moments, there are people working tirelessly to uncover the truth and protect the innocent. Remember that technology, for all its complexity, can be a powerful tool for justice when used by those dedicated to serving others. And most of all, remember Lori Annalise Page, not as a statistic or a case number, but as a child whose life mattered, whose death diminished us all, and whose story reminds us why we must never stop fighting to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The case of Lori Page is closed, but her memory lives on in the hearts of those who searched for her, in the dedication of those who sought justice for her, and in the lessons we can learn from the tragedy of her too short life. I still want to use this opportunity to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 2. Tonight, we're going to explore a case that's been haunting the Pacific Northwest for over a year now. It's a story that begins with a simple morning jog and ends with questions that investigators are still trying to answer. This is the story of what happened to 28-year-old Alexandra Alex Morrison on the morning of March 15, 2023, along the Riverside Trail in Spokane, Washington. Spokane, Washington sits beautifully in the eastern part of the state, where the Spokane River winds its way through the city like a silver ribbon. The Riverside Trail is one of the city's crown jewels, a 25-mile paved path that follows the river through urban parks, residential neighborhoods, and stretches of natural beauty that make you forget you're in the middle of a city of 220,000 people. The trail is popular year-round, but especially in early spring when the harsh winter finally begins to loosen its grip. March 15, 2023 was one of those perfect Pacific Northwest mornings, crisp at 38 degrees, with a light mist hanging over the river and the promise of warmer days ahead. Alexandra Morrison had moved to Spokane just 8 months earlier for her job as a software engineer at a local tech startup called Cascade Dynamics. She'd come from Portland, seeking a slower pace of life and the outdoor activities that the inland Northwest is famous for. At 28, Alex was the kind of person who attacked life with enthusiasm. She rock climbed, hiked, and had recently taken up trail running. Her apartment was a cozy one-bedroom in the Peaceful Valley neighborhood, just a 5-minute walk from the Riverside Trail. Friends and family would later describe Alex as fiercely independent, incredibly smart, and someone who never backed down from a challenge. She was also methodical, the kind of person who planned her routes, shared her location with friends, and always carried pepper spray and a whistle when running alone. Which is why what happened next was so completely out of character. March 14, 2023 was a Tuesday, and by all accounts, it was a perfectly ordinary day in Alex's life. She worked from home that day, participating in video calls with her team and putting the finishing touches on a mobile app that was set to launch the following month. Her colleagues would later tell investigators that she seemed upbeat and excited about the upcoming launch. That evening, Alex video called her parents in Portland. Her mother, Karen Morrison, would later recount how Alex seemed happy and settled in her new life. They talked about her job, her weekend plans to visit friends in Seattle, and her recent discovery of a great coffee shop near her apartment called Grind Coffee Bar. She was telling me about this barista who makes these amazing latte art designs, Karen would tell investigators. Alex was excited about the little things, you know? That's how she was. After the call with her parents, Alex spent the evening meal prepping for the week ahead. Her neighbor, 65-year-old retired teacher Margaret Chen, would later tell police that she saw Alex taking out her trash around 9:30 p.m., and that Alex had waved and mentioned she was planning an early morning run. Alex typically ran 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings. She kept a detailed log in a running app called Trail Map, noting her routes, times, and how she felt during each run. Investigators would later analyze these logs and find that Alex was a creature of habit when it came to her running routes. She had 3 primary routes she rotated between: a 3-mile loop through the South Hill neighborhood, a 5-mile trail along the Centennial Trail, and her favorite, a 7-mile route along the Riverside Trail that took her past the famous Spokane Falls and through Riverfront Park. The night of March 14th, Alex set her alarm for 6 a.m. She laid out her running clothes, black leggings, a bright pink running shirt, which would later become important to the investigation, and her favorite pair of Brooks running shoes. She charged her phone, filled her water bottle, and went to bed around 10:30 p.m. Alex's phone records show her alarm went off at 6 a.m. sharp. She turned it off immediately, no snooze button for Alex Morrison. The last digital footprint she would leave was at 6:23 a.m., when she opened her Trail Map app and selected her 7-mile Riverside Trail route. What makes this case particularly challenging is that Alex didn't actually start the route she'd selected in the app. Her phone's GPS data shows that she left her apartment at 6:32 a.m., but instead of heading northwest toward her usual starting point near the Spokane Falls, she headed southeast toward the quieter, more remote section of the trail. Margaret Chen heard Alex's front door close at what she estimated was around 6:30 a.m. "I was making my morning coffee," Margaret would later tell investigators. "I always get up early, and I heard her door close. I looked out the window and saw her walking toward the trail. She was wearing that bright pink shirt she always wore running." The first 45 minutes of Alex's run were captured by her phone's GPS. The data shows her maintaining a steady 8.5-minute-mile pace, which was typical for her training runs. She ran southeast along the trail for about 3.5 miles, reaching the Spokane Valley area where the trail passes through Mirabeau Park. This is where things start to get strange. At exactly 7:17 a.m., Alex's phone stopped recording GPS data. This wasn't a gradual loss of signal, it was an abrupt stop, as if her phone had been turned off or the battery had died. But Alex was obsessive about charging her devices, and her phone showed a 87% battery charge when the GPS tracking stopped. At 7:45 a.m., a jogger named Robert Kim was running the same trail in the opposite direction when he saw something that would later prove crucial to the investigation. About 200 yards off the main trail, down a steep embankment near the river, he saw a flash of bright pink. Robert would later tell investigators that he initially thought it might be a piece of trash or a discarded shirt, but something about it nagged at him. He was running late for work, though, so he made a mental note to check it out on his evening run if it was still there. It wouldn't be. Alex was supposed to meet her friend and coworker, Jessica Park, for lunch at 12:30 p.m. that Wednesday. When Alex didn't show up and didn't respond to text messages, Jessica initially wasn't worried. Alex was sometimes absorbed in her work and lost track of time. But when Alex didn't respond to messages all afternoon and didn't show up for a 4 p.m. team meeting that she had scheduled, Jessica became concerned. She knew Alex was reliable to a fault, especially about work commitments. Jessica decided to drive to Alex's apartment after work. She arrived around 6:15 p.m. and found Alex's car, a blue 2019 Honda Civic, parked in its usual spot. The apartment was locked, but Jessica knew Alex kept a spare key in a magnetic box under her car's rear bumper for emergencies. What Jessica found when she entered the apartment would puzzle investigators for months to come. Nothing seemed disturbed. Alex's work laptop was still open on the kitchen table, displaying the mobile app code she'd been working on. Her meal-prepped lunches were still in the refrigerator. Her bed was made, but her running clothes were gone. The only thing that seemed out of place was Alex's running shoes. Alex owned 3 pairs of running shoes and rotated them regularly to prevent injury. Her favorite pair, the Brooks shoes she'd laid out the night before, were nowhere to be found. But in the closet, investigators would later discover muddy footprints that appeared to have been made by those same shoes. The mud was still damp. Jessica called 911 at 6:47 p.m. The Spokane Police Department initially treated it as a routine missing person case. Adults have the right to disappear, and it hadn't been 24 hours yet. But Jessica insisted this was completely out of character for Alex, and she had a bad feeling about the whole situation. Officer Maria Santos took the initial report. She would later say that something about Jessica's genuine concern and the details about Alex's rigid routines made her take the case more seriously than she might have otherwise. The official search began at dawn on March 16, just over 24 hours after Alex was last seen. Detective Ray Thornton, a 15-year veteran of the Spokane Police Department, was assigned as the lead investigator. Detective Thornton had handled dozens of missing person cases, but something about this one felt different from the start. Most missing person cases resolve themselves within 48 hours, Detective Thornton would later explain. People show up, they were visiting a friend, they had a family emergency, they got cold feet about something. But Alexandra Morrison's case had too many pieces that didn't fit together. The search team included police officers, volunteer searchers, and a K-9 unit. They started at Alex's apartment and worked their way along the Riverside Trail, following the GPS data from her phone. The trail Alex had taken was well-traveled, even early in the morning, but no one remembered seeing a woman in a bright pink running shirt. Or at least, no one admitted to seeing her. At 2:30 p.m. on March 16, the search team reached the area where Alex's phone had stopped recording GPS data. This section of the trail runs parallel to the Spokane River, with dense vegetation on both sides. There are several informal paths that lead down to the river, popular with fishermen and people looking for a quiet spot to sit by the water. It was here that Detective Thornton made the first significant discovery. About 15 feet off the main trail, partially hidden under a fallen log, was Alex's phone. The device was undamaged but completely dead, despite having shown an 87% charge when the GPS stopped working. The location of the phone was puzzling. If Alex had simply dropped it while running, it would have been on or near the trail. If she had been attacked, the phone would likely have been thrown further away or taken entirely. Instead, it seemed to have been deliberately placed and hidden. It looked staged, Detective Thornton would later say. Like someone wanted us to find it, but not immediately. The discovery of Alex's phone prompted a more intensive search of the surrounding area. Crime scene technicians combed through the vegetation, looking for any other evidence. What they found raised more questions than it answered. About 30 yards from where the phone was discovered, investigators found what appeared to be a small piece of bright pink fabric caught on a thorn bush. The fabric was consistent with Alex's running shirt, but it was strange, it was a clean tear, as if it had been cut rather than torn by accident. More puzzling was what they found near the river's edge. In the soft mud by the water, there were footprints from what appeared to be women's running shoes, size 8.5, Alex's size. The prints led from the vegetation down to the water's edge, where they disappeared. But here's what was strange, the prints showed no signs of struggle. They were evenly spaced, suggesting a walking pace, not running. And they were deep and clear, as if they had been made deliberately. Detective Thornton brought in a forensic specialist to analyze the footprints. The specialist, Dr. Sarah Chen from Washington State University, determined that the prints had been made by Brooks running shoes, the same brand Alex was wearing. But the pattern of wear on the sole didn't match the wear pattern on Alex's other running shoes. These prints were made by someone who was either very careful about where they stepped, or who was deliberately creating a trail, Dr. Chen would later testify. The investigation team also found something else troubling. About 100 yards upstream from the footprints, a fisherman named Tom Bradley came forward with information. He had been fishing in that area around 7:30 a.m. on March 15 and had seen a woman matching Alex's description walking along the riverbank. But here's the thing that bothered Detective Thornton. Tom said the woman he saw was walking calmly, almost leisurely. She wasn't running, she wasn't in distress, and she wasn't alone. There was someone with her, Tom would tell investigators. I couldn't see who it was from that distance, but she was definitely talking to someone. While the physical search continued, Detective Thornton's team began digging into Alex's digital life. What they found was a picture of a woman who seemed to have no enemies and no obvious reason to disappear. Alex's phone records showed no unusual calls or texts. Her email accounts revealed nothing suspicious, just work correspondence, online shopping confirmations, and messages from friends and family. Her social media accounts painted the picture of someone who was happy with her new life in Spokane. But there was one thing that caught investigators' attention. 3 days before she disappeared, Alex had received a message on LinkedIn from someone claiming to be a photographer who wanted to hire her for a lifestyle shoot along the Riverside Trail. The message was from an account that had been created just days earlier and had no other activity. Alex had responded to the message, but cautiously. She thanked the person for the offer but said she wasn't interested in modeling. The photographer had responded with a message that, in hindsight, seemed oddly persistent. I understand your hesitation, but I think you'd be perfect for what I have in mind. I've seen you running along the trail, and you have exactly the look I need for this project. Would you be willing to meet for coffee to discuss it? Alex had never responded to that message. The LinkedIn account belonged to someone named David Rivers, but when investigators tried to trace it, they found it led to a dead end. The account had been created using a temporary email address, and the IP address it was created from bounced through several proxy servers, making it impossible to trace. Even more troubling, the account was deleted on March 16, the day after Alex disappeared and the same day the search began. As news of Alex's disappearance spread through Spokane, the community rallied together in a way that Detective Thornton had rarely seen. Hundreds of volunteers joined the search efforts. Local businesses donated food and supplies. Social media campaigns with hashtag #FindAlexMorrison spread across the Pacific Northwest. Alex's parents, Karen and David Morrison, drove up from Portland and established themselves at a local hotel, refusing to leave until they had answers. They held daily press conferences, pleading for information and keeping their daughter's case in the public eye. "Someone knows something," Karen Morrison would say at every press conference. "Alex is smart, she's careful, and she wouldn't just disappear. Someone out there has information that could bring her home." The case garnered national attention when true crime podcaster Emma Richardson featured it on her show, Vanished Without a Trace. The episode brought in hundreds of tips from across the country, though most led nowhere. But there was one tip that stood out. A woman from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, about 30 miles from Spokane, called to report that she had seen a woman matching Alex's description at a gas station on March 15 around 2 p.m. The woman was with a man, and she seemed distressed. "She kept looking around like she was trying to get someone's attention," the caller said. But the man with her kept steering her away from other people. The gas station security cameras had been malfunctioning that day, so there was no video to confirm the sighting. But it was the most credible lead the investigation had received. As we reach the end of our story tonight, Alex Morrison's case remains unsolved. It's been over a year since she disappeared from the Riverside Trail, and despite an extensive investigation, countless volunteers, and national media attention, she remains missing. Detective Thornton continues to work the case, following up on new leads as they come in. The Spokane Police Department has offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to Alex's safe return or the arrest of anyone responsible for her disappearance. The case reminds us that sometimes the most ordinary moments, a morning run, a simple routine, can become the beginning of an extraordinary mystery. And somewhere out there, someone has the answers that could bring Alexandra Morrison home to her family. If you have any information about the disappearance of Alexandra Morrison, please contact the Spokane Police Department at their tip line. Every piece of information, no matter how small it might seem, could be the key to solving this case. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 3. Tonight, I want to tell you about a case that demonstrates how modern forensic science can reach across decades to deliver justice. This is the story of Rebecca Hartwell, a 22-year-old college student whose murder in Salem, Oregon in 1985 remained unsolved for nearly 4 decades until a discarded piece of chewing gum led investigators to her killer. This case is particularly compelling because it shows how the smallest piece of evidence, something as mundane as a piece of gum carelessly spit onto the ground, can become the key that unlocks justice. It's a story about persistence, technological advancement, and the unwavering dedication of investigators who refuse to let a killer escape justice. Rebecca Ann Hartwell was the kind of young woman who lit up every room she entered. Standing 5 feet 4 inches tall with auburn hair that caught the light and green eyes that sparkled with intelligence, she was a junior at Willamette University majoring in psychology with dreams of becoming a counselor. Her friends described her as someone who genuinely cared about others, always ready to listen when someone needed to talk. In the spring of 1985, Rebecca was living in a small apartment just off campus with her roommate, Jennifer Mills. The two had been friends since their freshman year and had developed the comfortable routine of roommates who genuinely liked each other. Rebecca worked part-time at a local bookstore called Chapter and Verse, a cozy shop downtown that specialized in used books and had become a gathering place for students and locals alike. On the evening of April 23, 1985, Rebecca finished her shift at the bookstore at 8 p.m. The weather was typical for Oregon in late April, a light drizzle that made the streets gleam under the streetlights. Rebecca had planned to walk the 6 blocks home, something she'd done countless times before. Salem in 1985 felt like a safe place, especially the area around the university where students routinely walked alone after dark. The bookstore manager, David Thompson, remembered watching Rebecca leave that night. She had seemed in good spirits, chatting with him about a psychology paper she was working on and her plans for the upcoming weekend. She'd bought a paperback copy of The Road Less Traveled to read before bed, tucking it into her canvas bag along with her tips from the evening. When Rebecca didn't come home that night, her roommate Jennifer initially wasn't worried. Rebecca sometimes stayed late at the library or went to study groups that ran longer than expected. But when Rebecca didn't show up for her morning classes and hadn't called, Jennifer's concern grew. By noon on April 24, Jennifer had called Rebecca's family in Portland and contacted the bookstore. David Thompson confirmed that Rebecca had left at her usual time the previous evening. It was Jennifer who first called the Salem Police Department to report Rebecca missing. Detective Patricia Kowalski took the initial missing person report. A 10-year veteran of the Salem PD, Detective Kowalski had handled numerous missing person cases involving college students, most of which resolved within 24 to 48 hours when the student turned up safe with a reasonable explanation. But something about this case felt different to her from the beginning. Rebecca's apartment showed no signs of struggle, but several items were notably absent: her purse, her house keys, and oddly, a small gold locket that Jennifer said Rebecca never took off. It had been a gift from her grandmother and held a tiny photo of her family. The search began immediately. Officers canvassed the route between the bookstore and Rebecca's apartment, interviewing anyone who might have seen her. Salem wasn't a large city, and the downtown area was compact enough that someone walking alone at night would likely be noticed. It was a jogger named Michael Chen who found Rebecca's body 3 days later, on April 27. She was in Riverfront Park, partially concealed by blackberry bushes near the Willamette River. The location was only 4 blocks from downtown, but in an area that wasn't well lit or frequently traveled after dark. The crime scene told a brutal story. Rebecca had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her purse was missing, and the gold locket Jennifer had mentioned was gone from around her neck. To all appearances, this was a robbery gone wrong, a random crime of opportunity. Detective Kowalski, now leading the homicide investigation, meticulously documented every detail of the crime scene. The medical examiner, Dr. William Foster, determined that Rebecca had likely been killed within hours of leaving the bookstore. There were defensive wounds on her hands, indicating she had fought back against her attacker. But it was what the investigators found near the crime scene that would eventually solve the case 40 years later. About 15 feet from where Rebecca's body was discovered, crime scene technician Laura Martinez found several pieces of evidence that seemed unrelated to the crime: a cigarette butt, a beer can, and a piece of chewing gum stuck to the bottom of a park bench. In 1985, DNA analysis was still in its infancy. The crime scene team collected these items as a matter of protocol, but the technology to extract useful DNA profiles from such evidence didn't exist yet. The items were catalogued and stored in the evidence room, where they would remain for decades. The initial investigation was thorough but ultimately unsuccessful. Detectives interviewed dozens of people: Rebecca's friends, classmates, co-workers, and regular customers at the bookstore. They looked into anyone who might have had a reason to harm Rebecca, but she was universally described as kind and well-liked, with no known enemies. The investigation expanded to include known sex offenders in the area, but in 1985, there were no comprehensive databases to cross-reference. Everything had to be done manually, and without physical evidence linking anyone to the crime, the case gradually went cold. For Detective Kowalski, the Rebecca Hartwell case became one of those investigations that never truly ended. Even after retiring from the Salem Police Department in 2003, she would occasionally call the Detective Bureau to check if there had been any developments. Rebecca's case file grew thin over the years, but it never disappeared entirely. Rebecca's family never gave up hope for answers. Her parents, Robert and Margaret Hartwell, established a scholarship fund in Rebecca's name at Willamette University and organized annual memorial walks through downtown Salem. Every year on the anniversary of Rebecca's death, they would gather with friends and family to remember her and to keep public attention on her unsolved case. The case was officially reopened several times as new detectives were assigned to cold cases. In 1995, Detective James Rodriguez took a fresh look at the evidence and had the crime scene samples tested using newer DNA techniques. They were able to extract a partial DNA profile from evidence collected at the scene, but it wasn't complete enough to be useful for identification purposes. In 2003, the evidence was tested again using even more advanced techniques. This time, technicians were able to develop a more complete DNA profile, which was entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database. But there were no matches. The killer's DNA wasn't in the system. Detective Sarah Mitchell inherited the case in 2015 when she was assigned to the Salem PD's Cold Case Unit. She was a 20-year veteran with a reputation for her methodical approach to old cases. Detective Mitchell believed that advances in DNA technology might finally provide the breakthrough the case needed. In 2023, Detective Mitchell decided to take advantage of the latest developments in forensic genealogy. She contacted Parabon Nanolabs, a company that specialized in using DNA to create genetic profiles that could be compared to genealogy databases. The technique had been used successfully in several high-profile cold cases, including the identification of the Golden State Killer. The process was complex and time-consuming. First, technicians had to extract enough DNA from the evidence to create a detailed genetic profile. Then, they would upload this profile to genealogy databases to look for potential relatives of the unknown perpetrator. Dr. Lisa Chen, the forensic genealogist assigned to Rebecca's case, began the painstaking work of building family trees based on DNA matches. She found several distant relatives of the unknown suspect, people who shared small segments of DNA but were likely third or fourth cousins. Using public records, obituaries, and genealogy websites, Dr. Chen began constructing potential family trees. The work was meticulous, often requiring weeks to trace single family lines back several generations. She was looking for men who would have been the right age to commit the crime in 1985 and who had some connection to the Salem area. After 6 months of work, Dr. Chen had narrowed the field to 3 potential suspects. All were men who would have been in their 20s or 30s in 1985, and all had some connection to Oregon. One name stood out, Thomas Earl Bennett, who had been 28 years old in 1985 and was living in Salem at the time of Rebecca's murder. Thomas Earl Bennett had been living under the radar for nearly 4 decades. Born in 1957 in Eugene, Oregon, he had moved to Salem in 1983 to work at a lumber mill. He was described by co-workers as a loner who kept to himself and had a drinking problem that eventually cost him his job. In 1987, 2 years after Rebecca's murder, Bennett had been arrested for assault and spent 6 months in county jail. After his release, he'd moved to California, where he worked various manual labor jobs and had several more run-ins with law enforcement for minor offenses. But he'd never been convicted of a felony that would have required him to submit DNA to the CODIS database. Detective Mitchell began the careful process of confirming that Thomas Bennett was indeed the killer. She obtained a search warrant for Bennett's DNA, but there was a problem. Bennett had died in 2019 at the age of 62, apparently from complications related to alcoholism. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Fresno, California. Undeterred, Detective Mitchell worked with California authorities to obtain a court order for exhumation. In December 2023, Bennett's remains were disinterred and samples were sent to the Oregon State Police Crime Lab for DNA analysis. The results came back in January 2024. the DNA extracted from Thomas Bennett's remains was a perfect match to the DNA found at Rebecca Hartwell's crime scene. After nearly 39 years, they had identified her killer. With Bennett identified as the killer, Detective Mitchell began the process of reconstructing what had happened on the night of April 23, 1985. She reviewed all the original witness statements and physical evidence in light of this new information. What emerged was a picture of a random crime that could have been prevented. Bennett had been at a bar downtown that evening, drinking heavily. Several witnesses from 1985 remembered seeing him leave the bar around 7:30 p.m., clearly intoxicated and acting belligerently. The bar was only 2 blocks from Chapter and Verse bookstore, and the timing meant that Bennett would have been in the area right around the time Rebecca finished her shift. Detective Mitchell theorized that Bennett, drunk and looking for trouble, had spotted Rebecca walking alone and followed her. The piece of chewing gum that ultimately led to Bennett's identification had been stuck to the park bench for decades. Crime scene analysis suggested it had been there for some time before Rebecca's murder, but DNA testing proved it contained Bennett's saliva. The theory was that Bennett had been in the park earlier that evening, possibly scouting the area or simply wandering around while intoxicated. Detective Mitchell also discovered that Bennett had been questioned briefly during the original investigation in 1985, but only as part of the general canvass of local bars and their patrons. At the time, he'd provided an alibi that couldn't be verified, and without any physical evidence linking him to the crime, he was eliminated as a suspect. On February 15, 2024, the Salem Police Department held a press conference to announce that Rebecca Hartwell's murder had been solved. Detective Mitchell, now preparing for retirement, stood alongside Chief of Police Maria Santos and District Attorney Robert Kim to share the news with the media and the community. Rebecca's parents, now in their 80s, were present at the press conference. Robert Hartwell, speaking on behalf of the family, said that while the news brought some measure of closure, it also brought a renewed sense of loss. "We're grateful to finally have answers," he said, "but it doesn't bring Rebecca back. She would have been 61 years old now. She might have had children, grandchildren. That's what we mourn, not just who she was, but who she could have become." The case received significant media attention, partly because of the novel use of forensic genealogy and partly because it demonstrated how DNA evidence could survive for decades to eventually deliver justice. Several other police departments reached out to Salem PD to learn about their process, hoping to apply similar techniques to their own cold cases. Dr. Chen, the forensic genealogist, published a paper about the case in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, detailing the genealogical methods used to identify Bennett. The case became a teaching example in forensic science courses and law enforcement training programs. Jennifer Mills, Rebecca's former roommate, now a successful therapist living in Seattle, said that learning about the resolution of the case brought her both relief and sadness. "I've thought about Rebecca every day for almost 40 years, she said. "I'm glad we finally know what happened, but I'm also sad that this man was able to live his whole life without paying for what he did." The Rebecca Hartwell case represents a convergence of several technological advances that have revolutionized cold case investigations. Dr. Amanda Foster, a forensic scientist at Oregon State University who wasn't involved in the case but has studied it extensively, explains the significance of what happened. The DNA evidence in this case survived for nearly 4 decades in less than ideal storage conditions, Dr. Foster explains. "The fact that we were able to extract a usable profile speaks to both the resilience of DNA and the advances we've made in extraction and amplification techniques." The chewing gum that provided the crucial evidence had been stored in a paper envelope in a climate-controlled evidence room, but it had never been treated as priority evidence because its connection to the crime wasn't initially obvious. It was only when investigators began testing all biological evidence from the scene that they discovered the DNA profile. Forensic genealogy, the technique used to identify Bennett, relies on the fact that people share DNA with their relatives in predictable patterns. By comparing the suspect's DNA to profiles in genealogy databases, scientists can identify potential relatives and then use traditional genealogy methods to narrow down to specific individuals. The key is having enough people in the database, explains Dr. Chen, the genealogist who worked on the case. As more people submit their DNA to genealogy websites, our ability to solve these cases improves exponentially. We're likely to see many more cold cases solved using these techniques. The case also highlights the importance of preserving evidence, even when its relevance isn't immediately apparent. The piece of chewing gum that solved the case had been collected by crime scene technicians who had no way of knowing it would be crucial evidence decades later. The resolution of Rebecca Hartwell's murder had ripple effects throughout the law enforcement community and beyond. The Salem Police Department used the success of the case to secure funding for additional cold case investigations, and they hired a dedicated cold case detective to work full-time on unsolved crimes. Within 6 months of announcing the solution to Rebecca's case, the Salem PD received tips and new information on more than a dozen other cold cases. The publicity surrounding the case had reminded people of other unsolved crimes and encouraged them to come forward with information they might have forgotten or previously thought unimportant. The Hartwell family used the renewed attention to advocate for other families of murder victims. They testified before the Oregon legislature in support of funding for cold case investigations and DNA testing. Their advocacy helped secure a $2 million appropriation for the Oregon State Police Forensic Laboratory to process DNA evidence in unsolved cases. The case also had an impact on the genealogy community. Several genealogy websites updated their terms of service to clarify how DNA data might be used in criminal investigations, and many users expressed support for using their genetic information to help solve crimes. For the investigators who worked on the case over the decades, the resolution provided a sense of professional satisfaction that many described as career-defining. Detective Kowalski, the original investigator who had retired years earlier, said that learning about the solution to Rebecca's case was the best phone call I've ever received. "You never forget the victims," she said. "Rebecca was such a vibrant young woman with so much potential. I always believed we'd find her killer eventually, but I have to admit, I wondered if it would happen in my lifetime. I'm grateful it did." The Rebecca Hartwell case offers several important lessons for law enforcement, forensic scientists, and the general public. First, it demonstrates the crucial importance of evidence preservation. The items collected at the 1985 crime scene remained useful for DNA analysis nearly 4 decades later, but only because they were properly stored and catalogued. Second, the case shows how new technologies can breathe life into old investigations. The DNA profile that solved the case was actually developed years before Bennett was identified, but it took the development of forensic genealogy to make the connection. Third, the case highlights the value of persistence in cold case investigations. Detective Mitchell's decision to pursue forensic genealogy testing was based on her belief that advances in DNA technology might finally provide answers. Without her initiative, the case might have remained unsolved indefinitely. The case also demonstrates the importance of community involvement in solving crimes. The tips and information that came in after the case was resolved helped investigators understand Bennett's movements and activities in the months before and after Rebecca's murder. This information, while not necessary for the conviction, helped provide a more complete picture of what happened. For forensic genealogists, the case serves as an example of how their work can provide closure to families who have waited decades for answers. Dr. Chen says that working on the Hartwell case was one of the most rewarding experiences of her career. "Science can be abstract sometimes," she explains. "But when you're working on a case like this, you're very aware that there are real people waiting for answers. It's not just about the science, it's about justice and closure and helping families heal." While the focus of this case is rightfully on Rebecca Hartwell and her family, understanding Thomas Bennett's background helps explain how this tragedy occurred. Bennett's life was marked by alcohol abuse, unstable employment, and increasing social isolation. Born to a working-class family in Eugene, Bennett had struggled with behavioral problems from an early age. School records show that he was frequently in trouble for fighting and had difficulty maintaining friendships. He dropped out of high school in his junior year and bounced between various jobs. Bennett's drinking problem began in his teens and escalated throughout his 20s. Co-workers at the Salem lumber mill where he worked in the mid-1980s described him as unreliable and prone to angry outbursts, especially when he'd been drinking. In the months before Rebecca's murder, Bennett had been fired from the lumber mill for showing up to work intoxicated. He was behind on his rent and was drinking heavily most nights at various bars in downtown Salem. Several bartenders from that time period, interviewed during the cold case investigation, remembered him as a troublesome customer who often had to be asked to leave. After Bennett moved to California in 1987, his life continued to spiral downward. He was arrested several times for public intoxication, disturbing the peace, and minor assault charges. He never held a steady job for more than a few months and lived in a series of cheap apartments and boarding houses. Bennett died alone in a Fresno hospital in 2019, with no known relatives and few acquaintances. He had been living in a single-room occupancy hotel and was discovered unconscious by the building manager when he failed to pay his weekly rent. As I conclude Rebecca's story, I want us to remember that true crime isn't just about the mystery or the investigation, it's about real people whose lives were forever changed by violence. Rebecca Hartwell was a young woman with dreams and aspirations, a daughter who was loved, a friend who was cherished. Her murder in 1985 sent shockwaves through the Salem community and left her family devastated. For nearly 4 decades, they lived with the pain of not knowing who had killed their daughter and why. The resolution of the case in 2024 provided answers, but it couldn't restore the life that was lost or the years of wondering and waiting. The case also represents something hopeful, the idea that advances in science and technology can still deliver justice, even decades after a crime was committed. The piece of chewing gum that solved this case had been sitting in an evidence room for nearly 40 years, waiting for science to catch up to the possibilities it represented. For other families dealing with unsolved crimes, Rebecca's case offers both hope and a reminder that justice can take many forms and arrive at unexpected times. The investigators who worked on this case over the decades never gave up, and their persistence was ultimately rewarded. Detective Mitchell, who led the final investigation that identified Bennett, has said that the Hartwell case taught her never to underestimate the power of old evidence and new technology. She's now working on several other cold cases, applying the same combination of traditional detective work and cutting-edge forensic science. As for Rebecca Hartwell, she's remembered not just as a victim, but as a young woman who had much to offer the world. The scholarship fund established in her name has helped dozens of students pursue degrees in psychology and counseling, fields where Rebecca had hoped to make a difference herself. The last word belongs to Rebecca's father, Robert Hartwell, who said at the press conference announcing the case's resolution, Rebecca would have wanted her story to help other people. If her case can help solve other crimes or prevent other families from going through what we've experienced, then something good will have come from this terrible tragedy. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Rebecca Hartwell, not just as a victim of a senseless crime, but as a young woman whose life mattered, whose story deserves to be told, and whose case proves that sometimes, justice is patient, but it is also persistent. The DNA may have stayed silent for nearly 40 years, but in the end, it spoke the truth. And sometimes, that's all we can ask for, the truth, delivered at last. Please don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 4. Tonight, we're traveling to the scenic town of Cedar Lake, Minnesota, where the tranquil waters hide a mystery that has puzzled investigators for over 2 years now. This is the story of Amanda Reeves, a 28-year-old environmental scientist who vanished without a trace on a crisp October evening in 2022. What started as a routine research trip to collect water samples became one of Minnesota's most perplexing missing person cases. Amanda Reeves had always been drawn to water. Growing up in Rochester, Minnesota, she spent countless hours by the Zumbro River, collecting samples, studying aquatic life, and dreaming of a career that would let her protect the waterways she loved so much. By 2022, that dream had become reality. Amanda worked for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources as an environmental scientist, specializing in lake ecosystem health. Her colleagues described her as meticulous, passionate, and someone who never missed a deadline or forgot a detail. She lived in a cozy apartment in Bloomington, just a 20-minute drive from her office in St. Paul. Her life was beautifully ordinary. She had a routine she cherished. Every morning, she'd wake at 6:30, make her coffee in the same blue ceramic mug her grandmother had given her, and check her emails while watching the sunrise through her kitchen window. Amanda was dating Michael Chen, a software engineer she'd met through a hiking group 2 years earlier. They'd been talking about moving in together, maybe getting a dog. Michael would later tell investigators that Amanda had seemed excited about the future, making plans for Thanksgiving with his family and talking about a vacation to Yellowstone the following spring. On weekends, Amanda volunteered at the local aquarium, teaching children about water conservation. She had a gentle way with kids, answering their endless questions with patience and genuine enthusiasm. Miss Amanda always smelled like lavender, one 6-year-old would later tell her mother. She said it helped her think clearly. The Tuesday before she disappeared, Amanda had called her mother, Susan, for their weekly chat. They talked for 43 minutes, Susan remembered because she'd been timing her pot roast. Amanda had sounded happy, maybe a little tired from work, but nothing seemed unusual. They'd discussed plans for Amanda's birthday in November, just 3 weeks away. She was excited about this new project, Susan would later tell reporters, her voice barely above a whisper. Something about studying the effects of climate change on northern Minnesota lakes. She said it could really make a difference. That project would take Amanda to Cedar Lake, a pristine body of water about 90 minutes north of the Twin Cities. It was supposed to be a simple day trip, collect samples, take measurements, document any changes since the last survey. She'd done hundreds of similar trips. It should have been routine. Cedar Lake sits nestled in the heart of Minnesota's lake country, surrounded by dense forests of pine and birch. The lake is roughly 2 miles long and half a mile wide, with crystal clear water that reflects the sky like a mirror on calm days. In autumn, the area becomes a photographer's dream. The trees explode in brilliant reds, oranges, and golds, creating a natural amphitheater around the water. Local residents often joke that Cedar Lake is Minnesota's best-kept secret, though it's hardly secret at all. The lake supports a small but thriving community of about 300 people, most living in modest homes tucked back in the woods. Amanda's assignment was part of a larger study examining how changing weather patterns were affecting Minnesota's lake ecosystems. Climate scientists had noticed subtle but concerning changes, water temperatures rising slightly earlier in spring, ice forming later in fall, and shifts in the types of algae and fish populations. Cedar Lake had been chosen for the study because of its relatively pristine condition. Unlike many Minnesota lakes, it had minimal development around its shores and received little boat traffic. This made it an ideal, control location where scientists could study natural changes without the complicating factors of human activity. The work itself was methodical and peaceful. Amanda would use a small aluminum boat to reach specific sampling points across the lake, drop her instruments into the water, and record readings for temperature, oxygen levels, pH, and nutrient content. She'd also collect water samples in carefully labeled bottles to analyze back at the lab. Her supervisor, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, had worked with Amanda on dozens of similar projects. Amanda was the person I'd send on the most important assignments, Dr. Walsh would later tell investigators. She was thorough, careful, and she had this instinct for noticing things others might miss. If something was off about a lake's ecosystem, Amanda would spot it. The plan for October 15th was straightforward. Amanda would drive to Cedar Lake, arriving around 9 a.m. She'd spend the day collecting samples and taking measurements, then return to the office by 5 p.m. to begin processing the data. She'd done identical trips to other lakes dozens of times. Amanda had packed her equipment the night before, her sampling kit, portable testing devices, waterproof notebooks, and a thermos of coffee. She'd also brought a sandwich, an apple, and her favorite granola bars. Friends would later note that Amanda always overpacked food for field trips, a habit left over from her Girl Scout days. The forecast for October 15th looked perfect: sunny skies, temperature in the mid-60s, light winds. Even the lake conditions appeared ideal, with no weather warnings or advisories. It was, by all accounts, going to be a beautiful day for scientific work. What no one could have predicted was that Amanda Reeves would never return from that pristine lake hidden in the Minnesota woods. October 15, 2022, dawned crisp and clear in Bloomington. Amanda's upstairs neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, was watering her plants on the balcony when she heard Amanda's alarm go off at 6:30, just like always. Mrs. Hoffman had lived above Amanda for 3 years and knew her routine well. She was very consistent, Mrs. Hoffman would later tell police. Alarm at 6:30, shower by 6:45, coffee brewing by 7 o'clock. I could set my own schedule by Amanda's morning sounds. Security cameras at Amanda's apartment complex captured her loading equipment into her white Honda CR-V at 7:42 a.m. She appeared relaxed, dressed in her usual field work attire, khaki pants, a forest green pullover, and sturdy hiking boots. She'd pulled her shoulder-length brown hair back in a practical ponytail. Amanda stopped at the same gas station she always used, a Holiday station on Lyndale Avenue. The clerk, a college student named Tyler, recognized her immediately. She came in maybe twice a week, Tyler remembered. Always polite, always bought the same thing, a large coffee with cream, no sugar, and sometimes one of those protein bars. The gas station security footage showed Amanda filling up her tank at 8:03 a.m. She appeared to be checking something on her phone, probably the weather or her route to Cedar Lake. She paid for her gas and coffee, exchanged a few pleasant words with Tyler, and was back on the road by 8:12. Her phone records show she called Michael at 8:28 a.m. while driving north on Highway 169. The call lasted 6 minutes. Michael was at his office in Minneapolis, getting ready for a morning meeting. She sounded normal, Michael would later tell investigators, his voice thick with emotion. We talked about dinner plans for that evening. She wanted to try that new Thai place downtown. She said she'd text me when she finished up at the lake, probably around 4 o'clock. That text never came. Amanda's phone showed her GPS location tracking her steady progress north. She took Highway 169 to Highway 18, then a series of county roads that wound through increasingly rural countryside. The last ping from her phone tower was recorded at 9:47 a.m., placing her within a mile of Cedar Lake's public access point. At the lake, Amanda would have found a small gravel parking area surrounded by towering pines. There's a simple wooden dock extending about 30 feet into the water, and a boat launch suitable for small watercraft. On most weekdays in October, the area is deserted except for the occasional fisherman or hiker. Local resident Tom Erickson lived in a cabin about a quarter-mile from the lake access. He was outside splitting wood that morning and remembered hearing a car arrive around 10 a.m. I didn't think much of it, Tom said. People come and go at the lake all the time. Fishermen, mostly, or folks from the DNR doing their scientific work. Tom recalled hearing the sound of a small boat motor starting up sometime around 10:30. It ran for maybe 20 minutes, then quit. I figured whoever it was had finished their fishing and headed home. But Amanda hadn't headed home. By 6 p.m. that evening, when she failed to return to the office, Dr. Walsh began making phone calls. By 8 p.m., when Amanda still hadn't responded to calls or texts, Michael contacted the police. The last person to see Amanda Reeves was herself, captured on her own field camera at 11:17 a.m., standing on the dock at Cedar Lake, preparing to lower her water sampling equipment into the pristine depths below. The search for Amanda began at first light on October 16. Sheriff's deputies from Crow Wing County arrived at Cedar Lake to find Amanda's Honda CR-V parked in the small gravel lot, exactly where she would have left it. The vehicle was unlocked, with her purse and wallet still inside, containing her driver's license, credit cards, and $63 in cash. Her car keys were missing. Deputy Maria Santos was the first officer on scene. With 15 years of experience in search and rescue operations, Santos immediately noticed several things that struck her as unusual. Amanda's expensive water sampling equipment was nowhere to be found, but her lunch, a turkey sandwich and apple, sat untouched on the passenger seat. Most people, if they're planning to be out on a lake all day, they don't leave their food in the car, Santos would later note. It suggested she might have intended to come back to shore fairly quickly. The small aluminum boat that Amanda had rented from a local outfitter was found floating empty about 200 yards from the dock. The boat's owner, Pete Carlson, had delivered it to the lake access point early that morning as arranged. Carlson told investigators that Amanda had seemed experienced and comfortable around boats when she'd called to make the rental. She asked all the right questions, Carlson said. About the motor, the fuel, safety equipment. She knew what she was doing. Inside the boat, investigators found Amanda's field notebook, her pen, and her thermos, still half full of coffee that had gone cold. Her sampling equipment was not in the boat, leading investigators to speculate that she might have been in the process of collecting samples when something happened. The water around where the boat was found is relatively shallow, about 15 feet deep with a sandy bottom. Visibility in Cedar Lake is excellent, often extending down 20 or 30 feet on a clear day. If Amanda had fallen overboard, her body should have been visible from the surface. Search teams began working the lake systematically. Divers from the Crow Wing County Sheriff's Office searched the deeper areas, while boats with sonar equipment mapped the lake bottom. Volunteers from the local community joined ground teams searching the heavily wooded shoreline. Tom Erickson, the neighbor who had heard the boat motor, led searchers to a small inlet on the lake's east side where he sometimes saw wildlife. "I thought maybe she'd gone there to take water samples," he explained. "It's where the creek feeds into the lake, might be interesting to a scientist." The inlet search turned up something puzzling. Searchers found what appeared to be fresh disturbances in the muddy creek bank, as if someone had recently climbed out of the water. But there were no clear footprints, and no other signs of Amanda's presence. As the day wore on without any trace of Amanda, the search expanded beyond the immediate lake area. Teams began combing the surrounding forest, checking old logging roads and hunting trails. Search dogs were brought in to follow any potential scent trails. The dogs showed interest in several areas around the lake but couldn't establish a clear track. K-9 handler Sergeant Lisa Thompson noted that the dogs seemed confused, picking up scent trails that started and stopped abruptly. "It was like the trail just ended," Thompson told reporters. The dogs would follow a scent for 50 or 100 yards, then lose it completely. "I've seen this before when someone gets into a vehicle, but we didn't find any tire tracks or other evidence of vehicles in those areas." By evening on October 16, with no sign of Amanda despite an intensive search involving over 40 people, the case was officially classified as a missing person investigation. The search would continue for 3 more days, expanding to cover a 5-mile radius around Cedar Lake. They found nothing else. Detective Ray Kowalski was assigned as the lead investigator on Amanda's case. A 22-year veteran of the Crow Wing County Sheriff's Office, Kowalski had worked dozens of missing person cases, though most had relatively simple explanations: people who'd gotten lost hiking, hunters who'd had accidents, or individuals who'd chosen to disappear for personal reasons. Amanda's case felt different from the beginning. "Usually, when someone goes missing in our county, we can piece together what happened pretty quickly," Kowalski explained to Amanda's family during their first meeting. "Someone saw them head down a particular trail, or they told a friend about their plans, or they left some kind of trail we can follow. With Amanda, it's like she just vanished." The investigation began with Amanda's last known activities. Phone records showed her usual pattern of calls and texts, with nothing unusual in the days leading up to her disappearance. Her bank accounts showed no suspicious activity. The last charge was for gas on the morning she went missing. Computer forensics experts examined Amanda's work laptop and personal devices. They found detailed notes about her research project, including her plans for the Cedar Lake sampling trip. Everything appeared routine and professional. Her internet history showed typical activities: checking weather forecasts, reading scientific journals, and browsing social media. Kowalski and his team interviewed everyone in Amanda's life. Michael, her boyfriend, was understandably distraught but had a solid alibi. He'd been in meetings all day on October 15, with dozens of witnesses. Amanda's co-workers described her as reliable and passionate about her work, with no indication of personal problems or conflicts. Her family painted a picture of a young woman who was happy and optimistic about the future. Amanda's sister, Jennifer, flew in from Seattle to help with the search efforts. "Amanda was the most grounded person I knew," Jennifer told investigators. "She wouldn't just disappear. Something happened to her." The investigation expanded to include everyone who might have been in the Cedar Lake area on October 15. This proved challenging because the area is remote, with few security cameras or witnesses. The nearest business with surveillance equipment was a gas station 15 miles away. Tom Erickson, the neighbor who'd heard the boat motor, was interviewed multiple times. His account remained consistent: he'd heard a car arrive around 10 a.m., a boat motor start around 10:30, and then the motor had stopped after about 20 minutes. He hadn't seen any other vehicles or people in the area. Investigators also looked into the possibility that Amanda might have encountered someone else at the lake. October is hunting season in Minnesota, and while hunting wasn't allowed on the lake itself, hunters frequently used the surrounding forest. However, check-in records at local hunting camps showed no one else in the immediate area that day. The rental boat provided few clues. Pete Carlson, the owner, said the boat was in perfect mechanical condition when he delivered it. The motor had plenty of fuel and was running smoothly. There was no indication of any mechanical problems that might have caused an accident. One detail that puzzled investigators was the position of the boat when it was found. The empty boat had been drifting with the wind and current, but computer models suggested it had been in the water for several hours. If Amanda had fallen overboard around 10:30 a.m. when Tom Erickson heard the motor stop, the boat should have been much closer to shore when searchers arrived the next morning. Either she fell overboard much later than we thought, or someone moved the boat after she went missing, Kowalski noted in his case files. Neither explanation makes complete sense with the other evidence we have. The investigation also revealed that Cedar Lake held secrets that weren't immediately apparent to outsiders. As the investigation progressed, Detective Kowalski learned that Cedar Lake wasn't quite the pristine wilderness area it appeared to be. Local residents had been remarkably quiet about certain aspects of the lake's history, details that might have been relevant to Amanda's disappearance. The first revelation came from an unlikely source. Betty Morrison, an 84-year-old woman who'd lived near the lake for 60 years, approached Kowalski at the local diner where he was having lunch. Betty had been watching the investigation unfold and finally decided she needed to share what she'd been keeping to herself. "That lake has been taking people for longer than anyone wants to admit," Betty said quietly, sliding into the booth across from the detective. "My husband used to say it was just bad luck, but I'm not so sure anymore." Betty told Kowalski about 3 other incidents over the past 40 years. In 1982, a Minneapolis businessman named Robert Hayes had come to Cedar Lake for a weekend fishing trip and never returned. His boat was found empty, much like Amanda's, but his body was never recovered. The case was ruled an accidental drowning. In 1995, 2 teenagers from a nearby town had gone to the lake for a late-night swim. Only one came back. The survivor, a girl named Sarah, claimed her friend had simply vanished beneath the water while they were swimming together. Despite extensive searches, the boy's body was never found. Sarah moved away shortly after and, according to Betty, had never spoken publicly about what happened. The third incident was more recent. In 2008, an elderly man named Frank Garrison had been fishing from the dock when witnesses saw him fall into the water. Frank was a strong swimmer, but when other fishermen rushed to help, he was nowhere to be found. Again, no body was ever recovered. 4 people in 40 years, Betty said. All of them just gone. And always the same thing, no body, no real explanation. People around here don't like to talk about it. Bad for property values, bad for tourism. Kowalski was intrigued but skeptical. Lakes can be dangerous, especially for people who aren't familiar with local conditions. Currents, cold water, and underwater obstacles can turn a simple accident into a tragedy. But Betty's information raised questions about whether there might be something specific about Cedar Lake that made it particularly hazardous. The detective decided to investigate the lake's physical characteristics more thoroughly. He contacted the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources for geological surveys and depth charts. What he learned was interesting. Cedar Lake was deeper than most people realized. While the areas near shore averaged 15 to 20 feet deep, the center of the lake dropped to over 80 feet. More importantly, the lake had several underwater features that weren't marked on recreational maps: sudden drop-offs, submerged boulders, and what appeared to be an extensive cave system along the eastern shore. Dr. Patricia Lundgren, a geologist at the University of Minnesota, agreed to consult on the case. She explained that Cedar Lake sat in a depression formed by ancient glacial activity, with bedrock that contained limestone formations. Over thousands of years, underground water flow had carved out caves and tunnels beneath the lake. It's possible that someone could become trapped in one of these underwater caves, Dr. Lundgren explained. The openings might not be visible from the surface, but a person in the water could be pulled in by currents or might seek shelter there and become disoriented. This raised a chilling possibility. If Amanda had fallen into the water and been drawn into an underwater cave system, her body might never be found. The caves could extend for miles underground, connecting to other bodies of water or emerging in remote locations far from Cedar Lake. But this theory didn't explain why Amanda would have been in the water in the first place. Her work involved collecting samples from the boat, not swimming or diving. And the water temperature in October would have been dangerously cold, around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Even if she'd fallen overboard, hypothermia would have been a serious concern within minutes. As Kowalski delved deeper into the lake's secrets, he discovered one more troubling piece of information. Tom Erickson, the neighbor who'd been so helpful in the search, hadn't told the complete truth about what he'd observed on October 15th. 3 weeks after Amanda's disappearance, Tom Erickson called Detective Kowalski and asked to meet privately. They arranged to meet at Tom's cabin, a modest structure tucked back in the woods about a quarter-mile from Cedar Lake's shore. Tom was clearly nervous when Kowalski arrived. The 67-year-old retired logger had been cooperative throughout the investigation, but now he seemed reluctant to make eye contact. After offering the detective coffee, Tom sat heavily in his recliner and began to speak in a halting voice. "I need to tell you something I should have said from the beginning," Tom said. "I didn't lie exactly, but I didn't tell you everything I saw that day." Tom's revised account was more detailed and considerably more troubling. He had indeed heard a car arrive around 10 a.m. and a boat motor start around 10:30. But there had been more activity at the lake that morning than he'd initially reported. "Around 11:30, maybe 11:45, I heard voices," Tom said. "At first I thought it might be the radio, but then I realized people were talking down by the water. A man and a woman, it sounded like. I couldn't make out words, but it seemed like they were having some kind of disagreement." Tom explained that he'd been curious enough to walk partway down the trail toward the lake, but the voices had stopped before he could see who was there. He'd returned to his wood splitting, thinking it was probably just fishermen or hikers. "Then around noon, I heard a car door slam and an engine start up," Tom continued. "But here's the thing, it didn't sound like the same car that had arrived earlier. This one had a different engine note, deeper, like maybe a truck or SUV." Kowalski asked why Tom hadn't mentioned this before, and the older man's answer was both simple and frustrating. "I thought I might have been imagining things," Tom said. "I'm not as sharp as I used to be, and I was focused on my work. When you asked me about what I'd heard, I only told you the things I was sure about. But I've been thinking about it every day since, and I'm pretty certain there was someone else there. This revelation changed the entire complexion of the investigation. If Tom's revised account was accurate, Amanda might not have been alone at Cedar Lake. Someone else had been there, someone who'd arrived separately and left around noon, roughly the time when Amanda would have been finishing her sampling work. Kowalski pressed Tom for more details. Could he describe the voices? Were they arguing or just talking? How certain was he about the timing? Tom was frustratingly vague on most points, but he was certain about one thing. The second vehicle had been much louder than Amanda's Honda CR-V. I know the sound of her car because she'd been out here before, Tom said. This was something bigger, with a V8 engine probably. The detective asked if Tom had seen any other vehicles in the area recently, and this question triggered another reluctant admission. Tom had noticed a dark-colored pickup truck parked on the old logging road about half a mile from the lake on several occasions over the past month. He'd assumed it was a hunter or someone fishing, but he'd never seen the driver. It was always gone by evening, Tom said. I figured it was someone who worked in town and came out here to relax after work. But now I'm wondering if I should have paid more attention. Kowalski immediately organized a search of the logging road and surrounding area. The search turned up tire tracks that appeared to be from a full-size pickup truck, but rain over the past few weeks had degraded the impressions too much to be useful for identification. However, searchers did find something else interesting about 100 yards from where the tire tracks were discovered. Hidden in a thicket of bushes was a small pile of items that appeared to have been deliberately concealed: a pair of latex gloves, a roll of duct tape, and a plastic tarp. The items were sent to the state crime lab for analysis, but the results were inconclusive. The gloves and tape were common brands available at any hardware store, and while they tested positive for trace amounts of human DNA, the samples were too degraded to be useful for comparison. Still, the discovery raised alarming questions about what might have happened to Amanda. The items suggested premeditation. Someone had been prepared for something. But what, exactly, remained a mystery. With Tom's revised testimony, the investigation shifted focus from an accidental drowning to a possible crime. Kowalski began looking for connections between Amanda and anyone who might have wanted to harm her, while also searching for information about mysterious pickup trucks and their owners in the Cedar Lake area. What he found would deepen the mystery even further. The breakthrough in Amanda's case came from an unexpected source: a traffic camera 60 miles away in Brainerd, Minnesota. Detective Kowalski had requested footage from every camera within a 50-mile radius of Cedar Lake for October 15, hoping to identify vehicles that might have been in the area. Most of the footage was routine: local residents, delivery trucks, tourists heading to cabins for the weekend. But one vehicle caught the attention of the investigative team: a dark blue Ford F-150 pickup truck captured on camera at 2:17 p.m., traveling south on Highway 18 away from the Cedar Lake area. The truck's license plate was partially obscured by mud, but the visible numbers led investigators to registered owner Dale Hoffman, a 45-year-old construction worker from Little Falls, Minnesota. Hoffman had no obvious connection to Amanda, but when detectives ran his background check, they discovered several concerning details. Hoffman had a criminal record dating back 20 years, including convictions for assault, harassment, and stalking. Most recently, he'd been arrested in 2019 for following and photographing women at a regional park, though the charges had been dropped when the victims declined to testify. When Kowalski and his partner arrived at Hoffman's address, they found a man who seemed both nervous and hostile. Hoffman initially denied being anywhere near Cedar Lake on October 15, claiming he'd been at work all day. However, when confronted with the traffic camera footage, his story began to change. "Okay, maybe I was up that way," Hoffman admitted. "I like to drive around, look at the fall colors. It's not a crime to drive on public roads." Hoffman's employer confirmed that he'd called in sick on October 15, contradicting his initial claim about being at work. When pressed for details about his activities that day, Hoffman became increasingly agitated and eventually demanded to speak with a lawyer. A search warrant for Hoffman's property revealed several items of interest. In his garage, investigators found muddy boots that appeared to match footprints found near the creek inlet at Cedar Lake. They also discovered a collection of photographs, hundreds of images of women taken at parks, lakes, and other outdoor locations around central Minnesota. Many of the photos appeared to have been taken without the subject's knowledge, using a telephoto lens from a concealed position. The women were engaged in ordinary activities, hiking, picnicking, swimming, jogging, but the secretive nature of the photography was deeply troubling. Among the photographs, investigators found several images of Cedar Lake taken over the past year. The pictures showed various people engaging in recreational activities at the lake, including what appeared to be DNR employees taking water samples. One photo, taken from the woods near Tom Erickson's cabin, showed a woman in work clothes standing on the dock with scientific equipment. While the image was too distant and blurry to definitively identify Amanda, the timing and context were highly suspicious. The photo's metadata indicated it had been taken in September 2022, just 1 month before Amanda's disappearance. Hoffman was arrested and charged with stalking and harassment based on the photographic evidence, but prosecutors felt they didn't have enough proof to charge him with Amanda's disappearance. The case against him was circumstantial. He'd been in the area, he had a history of inappropriate behavior toward women, and he'd lied about his whereabouts. But there was no direct evidence linking him to whatever had happened to Amanda. During questioning, Hoffman's lawyer allowed him to provide a limited statement about October 15. Hoffman claimed he'd driven to Cedar Lake to take photographs of fall foliage but had left when he saw someone was already there using a boat. "My client is a nature photographer," his lawyer explained. "He prefers to work alone and doesn't like to disturb other people who are enjoying the outdoors. When he saw the lake was occupied, he left to find another location." The timeline was plausible but couldn't be verified. If Hoffman had arrived at Cedar Lake around 11:30 a.m., about the time Tom Erickson heard voices, he might have encountered Amanda while she was collecting water samples. What happened next remained a mystery. As 2022 turned into 2023, the investigation into Amanda's disappearance had produced a person of interest but no definitive answers. Hoffman remained in jail on the stalking charges, but Amanda was still missing, and her family was no closer to understanding what had happened to her. The case had become one of those mysteries that haunts investigators, plenty of theories, plenty of suspicious circumstances, but no clear resolution. Cedar Lake had kept its secrets, and Amanda Reeves remained among the missing. But sometimes, in cases like these, the truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. And there we leave Amanda's story for tonight. Like so many true crime mysteries, her case remains open, waiting for that one piece of evidence, that one witness, that one moment of truth that will finally bring answers to those who loved her. The investigation continues, as it does for thousands of missing person cases across the country. Families wait, investigators pursue new leads, and somewhere out there, the truth waits to be discovered. Now let's move on to our last story. Story 5. The Green River winds through the heart of Washington state like a dark ribbon, carrying snowmelt from the Cascade Mountains through farmland and forests before joining the larger waterways that eventually reach Puget Sound. For most of its journey, it's a peaceful waterway where families come to fish and children play along its banks during summer afternoons. But in the summer of 1982, the Green River began giving up secrets that would haunt the Pacific Northwest for more than 2 decades. Bodies. Young women who had been strangled, beaten, and dumped along the riverbanks like discarded refuse. What started as a few isolated discoveries would eventually become the largest serial killer investigation in American history, claiming at least 49 confirmed victims and terrorizing an entire region. This is the story of the Green River Killer, a predator who stalked the streets of Seattle and Tacoma for years, targeting society's most vulnerable women. It's the story of the dedicated investigators who refused to give up, even as the case went cold and the killer seemed to vanish into the shadows. And ultimately, it's the story of how modern forensic science and old-fashioned detective work finally brought one of America's most prolific killers to justice. The man responsible would turn out to be someone nobody suspected, a mild-mannered truck painter who lived quietly in the suburbs, raised his children, and attended church regularly. For 20 years, Gary Leon Ridgway hid in plain sight while investigators searched desperately for the monster who was destroying so many lives. July 15, 1982, started like any other summer day in the Seattle area. The morning was clear and warm, with the promise of another beautiful Pacific Northwest afternoon. Two young boys, riding their bikes along the Green River near the Peck Bridge in Kent, Washington, were looking for a good spot to go swimming when they made a discovery that would change their lives forever. Floating face down in the shallow water near the riverbank was the body of a young woman. The boys, initially thinking it might be a mannequin or a joke, quickly realized they were looking at something much more serious. They raced home and told their parents, who immediately called the police. King County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene within minutes and quickly determined that they were dealing with a homicide. The victim was a young African-American woman, probably in her teens or early 20s, who had been in the water for several days. She was naked, and there were obvious signs of violence. Most disturbingly, she had been weighted down with rocks, suggesting that someone had deliberately tried to hide her body in the river. The victim was identified as Wendy Lee Caulfield, a 16-year-old who had been reported missing from Tacoma just over a week earlier. Wendy had been living a dangerous life on the streets, working as a prostitute in the area known as the Strip, a stretch of Pacific Highway South where sex workers gathered to find clients. She had been trying to make money to survive, but that decision had put her directly in the path of a predator. Detective Dave Reichert of the King County Sheriff's Office was assigned to lead the investigation. Reichert was an experienced investigator who had worked hundreds of cases, but something about this murder bothered him more than usual. The deliberate nature of the body disposal, the victim's lifestyle, and the remote location where she was found suggested that this wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This felt like the work of someone who had killed before, or would kill again. Reichert's instincts proved correct just 1 month later. On August 12, 1982, a man searching for bottles and cans along the Green River made another horrific discovery. This time, it was the bodies of 3 young women, all found within a few hundred yards of where Wendy Caulfield had been discovered. The victims were Marcia Chapman, 31, Cynthia Hines, 17, and Opal Mills, 16. Like Wendy, all 3 women had been working as prostitutes in the Tacoma-Seattle area. Like Wendy, they had been strangled and their bodies dumped in or near the river. The similarities were too striking to be coincidental: the same location, the same victim profile, the same method of killing. Detective Reichert knew he was dealing with a serial killer. The discovery of multiple bodies in such a short time period sent shockwaves through the local community and law enforcement. Serial killers were relatively rare, and the Pacific Northwest hadn't experienced anything like this since the Ted Bundy cases in the 1970s. The media attention was intense, and public fear began to grow as people realized that a predator was actively hunting in their area. What made this case particularly challenging was the victim profile. The killer was targeting prostitutes, women who lived dangerous lives on the margins of society, whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or reported. These were women who often used fake names, moved frequently, and had complicated relationships with both law enforcement and their families. In many cases, it would be weeks or months before anyone realized they were missing. Detective Reichert understood that solving this case would require a different approach than traditional homicide investigations. He would need to build relationships with the women working on the Strip, gain their trust, and convince them to share information about potential suspects. He would also need to coordinate with multiple jurisdictions, since the killer seemed to be operating across city and county lines. The formation of the Green River Task Force in late 1982 marked the beginning of what would become the largest serial killer investigation in American history. The task force brought together investigators from multiple agencies, including the King County Sheriff's Office, Seattle Police Department, FBI, and Washington State Patrol. They were given unlimited resources and a single mandate: catch the Green River Killer before he struck again. But even as the task force was being assembled, the killer was continuing his work. Throughout the fall and winter of 1982, more bodies were discovered. Some were found along the Green River, giving the case its name, but others were discovered in forests, abandoned lots, and remote areas throughout King County. The killer seemed to be accelerating his activities, and investigators realized they were in a race against time. As the body count continued to rise throughout 1982 and 1983, Detective Dave Reichert made a conscious decision that would define his approach to the case for the next 20 years. He would learn the name, face, and story of every single victim. He would visit their families, understand their backgrounds, and ensure that they were remembered as more than just statistics in a serial killer investigation. Deborah Lynn Bonner was 23 years old when she disappeared in July 1982. She had grown up in a troubled home and had turned to prostitution as a teenager to survive. But Deborah was more than her circumstances. She was a mother who loved her young daughter and dreamed of getting off the streets and building a better life. Her family described her as funny and caring, someone who would give away her last dollar to help a friend in need. Marcia Faye Chapman was 31 and had been working the streets for several years when she became one of the Green River Killer's victims. She had struggled with drug addiction but was trying to get clean and reconnect with her family. Marcia was intelligent and articulate, and those who knew her said she had a quick wit and a generous heart. She had been planning to leave Seattle and start over somewhere else, but she never got the chance. Cynthia Jean Hines was just 17 years old, one of the youngest victims. She had run away from home as a teenager and ended up on the streets of Seattle, where she fell into prostitution as a means of survival. Despite her circumstances, Cynthia maintained contact with her family and had been talking about coming home. Her mother later said that Cynthia was creative and artistic, someone who might have pursued art or music if she had been given the opportunity. Opal Charmaine Mills was 16, another teenager whose life was cut short by violence. She had been living in foster care and had aged out of the system with few resources and limited support. Like many young women in similar situations, she had turned to prostitution to meet her basic needs. Those who knew Opal remembered her as resilient and determined, someone who was trying to make the best of a difficult situation. As 1983 progressed, the list of victims continued to grow. Giselle and Levorn, 17. Deborah Estes, 15. Linda Jane Rule, 16. Wendy Stevens, 14. Each name represented a life that had been violently ended, dreams that would never be fulfilled, and families that would never be the same. What struck investigators was how young many of the victims were. These weren't hardened criminals or women who had chosen prostitution as a career, they were often teenagers who had fallen through the cracks of the social safety net. Many had histories of abuse, neglect, or family dysfunction that had led them to the streets. They were vulnerable young women who had been failed by the systems that should have protected them. Detective Reichert made it his mission to understand not just how these women had died, but how they had lived. He spent countless hours interviewing their families, friends, and associates. He learned about their hopes and fears, their struggles and dreams. He came to understand that while they had all made similar choices that put them in danger, they were each unique individuals with their own stories and personalities. This approach was unusual in law enforcement at the time. Serial killer investigations typically focused on the perpetrator, building a profile, understanding his methods, and tracking his movements. But Reichert understood that to catch this killer, he needed to understand his victims. Their lifestyle patterns, their regular locations, their relationships, all of this information could provide clues about how and where the killer was finding them. The investigation revealed that most of the victims had been working along Pacific Highway South, particularly in the areas around SeaTac Airport and the cities of Federal Way and Des Moines. This stretch of road, known locally as the Strip, was where young women would walk or stand, looking for clients who would pick them up in cars. It was a dangerous way to make money, but for many of these women, it seemed like their only option. Reichert and his team began conducting regular patrols of the Strip, not to arrest the women working there, but to build relationships and gather information. They handed out business cards and encouraged the women to call if they saw anything suspicious. They also began documenting which women were working where and when, creating a database that might help them identify patterns in the killer's behavior. This community policing approach was controversial within law enforcement. Some officers felt that prostitutes were criminals who didn't deserve special protection. But Reichert understood that these women were both witnesses and potential victims, and that their cooperation could be crucial to solving the case. His respectful treatment of the women on the strip eventually earned their trust and led to valuable information about suspicious clients and potential suspects. By 1984, the Green River Task Force had grown to include more than 25 full-time investigators and support staff. They had established a dedicated headquarters, implemented sophisticated tracking systems, and were coordinating with law enforcement agencies across the country. The investigation was consuming enormous resources, but the bodies kept appearing and public pressure continued to mount. The task force developed a comprehensive approach to the investigation that combined traditional detective work with cutting-edge forensic science. They created detailed timelines of each victim's last known movements, mapped the locations where bodies were discovered, and analyzed physical evidence using the most advanced techniques available. They also began working with FBI profilers to develop a psychological portrait of the killer. The FBI profile suggested that the Green River Killer was likely a white male in his 20s or 30s who lived or worked in the area where the crimes were occurring. He was probably employed in a job that gave him flexibility and mobility, allowing him to hunt for victims and dispose of bodies without arousing suspicion. The profilers believed he would appear normal to his family and friends, possibly married with children, active in his community, and skilled at maintaining a facade of respectability. Most importantly, the profile suggested that the killer had a deep hatred of prostitutes and viewed them as disposable. His method of killing, strangulation, was personal and allowed him to watch his victims die. The careful disposal of bodies indicated someone who was organized and methodical, but the increasing frequency of murders suggested that his compulsions were growing stronger over time. Armed with this profile, investigators began developing lists of potential suspects. They looked at men who had been arrested for soliciting prostitutes, those with histories of violence against women, and anyone who had been reported as suspicious by the women working on the strip. They also examined employees of businesses along Pacific Highway South, delivery drivers, taxi drivers, and anyone else whose job brought them into regular contact with the area. One name that appeared early on their suspect list was Gary Leon Ridgway. In 1982, Ridgway had been arrested for soliciting an undercover police officer posing as a prostitute. During questioning, he had seemed nervous and had provided inconsistent stories about his activities. When investigators learned that Ridgway worked as a truck painter at Kenworth Trucking Company and lived near the areas where bodies were being discovered, he became a person of interest. In 1984, investigators interviewed Ridgway extensively about his possible involvement in the murders. He denied any knowledge of the crimes and agreed to take a polygraph test, which he passed. At the time, polygraph results were considered reliable evidence, and Ridgway's apparent truthfulness led investigators to focus their attention elsewhere. They also took hair and saliva samples from Ridgway for comparison with evidence from the crime scenes, but the forensic technology of the 1980s was not sophisticated enough to definitively link him to the murders. Despite their intensive efforts, the investigation seemed to be stalling. The killer had apparently gone dormant, no new bodies were being discovered, and no new leads were developing. Some investigators began to wonder if the Green River Killer had died, moved away, or been incarcerated for other crimes. The task force was gradually reduced in size as resources were diverted to other cases. But Detective Dave Reichert refused to give up. Even as the official investigation was scaled back, he continued working the case on his own time. He maintained contact with the families of victims, followed up on tips and leads, and kept the case files active and organized. He had made a promise to the victims' families that he would never stop looking for their daughter's killer, and he intended to keep that promise. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, Reichert continued to investigate new missing persons cases and unidentified remains that might be connected to the Green River Killer. He also kept track of Gary Ridgway, periodically checking on his activities and whereabouts. Although Ridgway had passed the polygraph test, something about him continued to bother Reichert. There was something in Ridgway's demeanor during their interviews, a coldness behind his mild exterior, that made Reichert believe he was hiding something. As the 1990s progressed, the Green River case gradually faded from public attention. The task force had been officially disbanded, and most of the investigators had moved on to other assignments. The families of the victims continued to grieve and seek answers, but it seemed increasingly likely that the killer would never be identified. Detective Dave Reichert, however, refused to let the case die. Even as he was promoted and given new responsibilities within the King County Sheriff's Office, he continued to work the Green River case whenever possible. He had boxes of evidence and files stored in his office, and he would periodically review them, looking for connections or clues that might have been missed. Reichert's dedication to the case became legendary within law enforcement circles. Colleagues would sometimes find him in his office late at night, poring over crime scene photographs and victim timelines. He attended every funeral that he could, maintaining relationships with the victims' families and assuring them that the case was not forgotten. He also continued to patrol the Strip occasionally, checking in with women who were still working there and gathering information about suspicious activity. During this period, Reichert also began working with other law enforcement agencies on similar cases around the country. The Green River investigation had established new protocols for serial killer cases, and Reichert was often called upon to share his expertise with other departments. He hoped that by helping solve other cases, he might gain insights that could be applied to the Green River murders. Meanwhile, Gary Ridgway continued to live his seemingly normal life in the Seattle area. He had remarried in 1985 to a woman named Judith Mawson, who knew nothing about his dark past. To his neighbors and co-workers, Ridgway appeared to be a devoted husband and father who worked hard, attended church regularly, and lived a quiet, unremarkable life. He continued working at Kenworth Trucking Company, where he was known as a reliable employee who rarely missed work and got along well with his colleagues. But investigators would later learn that Ridgway had not stopped killing after 1984. He had simply become more careful about disposing of bodies and had spread his activities over a wider geographic area. Some victims were never found, while others were discovered years later in remote locations far from the original Green River dump sites. Ridgway had learned from his mistakes and had adapted his methods to avoid detection. The breakthrough that would eventually solve the case came from an unexpected source: advances in DNA technology. In the mid-1990s, forensic scientists developed new techniques that could extract DNA profiles from smaller and more degraded biological samples. This technology offered the possibility of re-examining physical evidence from the Green River crime scenes that had been considered unusable with earlier methods. In 1997, the King County Sheriff's Office decided to reopen the Green River investigation using these new DNA techniques. A small team of investigators, led by Detective Tom Jensen, was assigned to review all of the physical evidence from the original crime scenes. They focused particularly on biological samples that might contain the killer's DNA, samples that had been collected but could not be analyzed with the technology available in the 1980s. The review process was painstaking and methodical. Each piece of evidence had to be carefully catalogued, photographed, and analyzed. Crime scene samples were sent to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory, where forensic scientists used the latest DNA extraction and analysis techniques to develop genetic profiles. The process was slow and expensive, but it offered the best hope of identifying the Green River Killer after more than 15 years. As the DNA analysis progressed, investigators also began the process of collecting comparison samples from the original suspects in the case. They wanted to be prepared to compare any DNA profiles they developed from the crime scenes with samples from the men who had been considered potential suspects during the original investigation. Gary Ridgway's name was still on the suspect list, and investigators were particularly interested in re-examining the samples they had collected from him in 1987. At that time, the samples had been compared with crime scene evidence using less sophisticated techniques, and no definitive matches had been found. But with the new DNA technology, it might be possible to make more precise comparisons. In September 2001, nearly 20 years after the first Green River victim was discovered, forensic scientist Beverly Himmick was working in the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory when she made the discovery that would finally solve the case. She was analyzing DNA extracted from semen samples found on several of the Green River victims, comparing them with DNA profiles from various suspects. When Himmick compared the crime scene DNA with a sample that had been collected from Gary Ridgway in 1987, she found a perfect match. The probability that the DNA could have come from someone other than Ridgway was astronomically small, less than 1 in a billion. After nearly 2 decades of investigation, they finally had scientific proof that Gary Ridgway was the Green River killer. Detective Tom Jensen, who was leading the renewed investigation, immediately contacted Dave Reichert with the news. Reichert, who had been elected King County Sheriff, felt a mixture of vindication and sorrow. He had always suspected Ridgway, but he also knew that the confirmation meant that dozens of families would finally learn the truth about what had happened to their daughters. The challenge now was building a case that would result in a conviction. DNA evidence was powerful, but prosecutors wanted to ensure they had enough additional evidence to guarantee a successful prosecution. They also had to decide whether to seek the death penalty, which would require proving aggravating circumstances beyond the basic facts of the murders. Investigators began conducting intensive surveillance of Ridgway while they built their case. They wanted to ensure he didn't flee or destroy evidence, but they also hoped to gather additional information about his activities and behavior. The surveillance revealed that Ridgway continued to live a seemingly normal life, going to work, attending church, and spending time with his wife and family. On November 30, 2001, investigators decided they had enough evidence to make an arrest. Ridgway was taken into custody at his workplace, Kenworth Trucking Company, where he had been employed for over 30 years. His arrest came as a complete shock to his co-workers, who described him as quiet, polite, and hard-working. None of them had ever suspected that the mild-mannered man they had worked alongside for decades was one of America's most prolific serial killers. The arrest of Gary Ridgway made national headlines and brought closure to many families who had been waiting for answers for nearly 20 years. But it also raised new questions about how someone could live such a double life for so long without being detected. How had Ridgway managed to kill dozens of women while maintaining the facade of a normal, respectable citizen? Initially, Ridgway was charged with 4 counts of aggravated first-degree murder in the deaths of Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Christensen. Prosecutors announced that they would seek the death penalty, arguing that the murders were particularly heinous and that Ridgway represented a continuing threat to society. Ridgway's defense team, led by attorneys Anthony Savage, Todd Grunhagen, and Michelle Shaw, faced an enormous challenge. The DNA evidence against their client was virtually irrefutable, and investigators were continuing to link him to additional murders. Their only hope was to negotiate a plea agreement that would spare Ridgway's life in exchange for information about his crimes and the locations of victims who had never been found. The negotiations between prosecutors and Ridgway's defense team lasted for nearly 2 years. Prosecutors wanted to ensure that any plea agreement would provide maximum closure for the victims' families, while the defense team worked to save their client's life. The key to reaching an agreement was Ridgway's willingness to provide detailed confessions about his crimes and to help locate victims whose bodies had never been found. In June 2003, Gary Ridgway finally agreed to plead guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder in exchange for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As part of the plea agreement, he also agreed to cooperate fully with investigators, providing detailed confessions about each murder and assisting in the recovery of additional victims. The confession process began immediately after the plea agreement was signed. Ridgway met with investigators for hundreds of hours over several months, providing chilling details about his crimes. What emerged from these sessions was a portrait of a killer whose compulsions had driven him to murder for more than 2 decades. Ridgway confessed that his first murder had occurred in 1982, around the time that Wendy Caulfield's body was discovered in the Green River. He revealed that he had been soliciting prostitutes since the 1970s and had gradually developed a hatred for the women he was paying for sex. He viewed them as disposable and began fantasizing about killing them. His method was typically to pick up women along Pacific Highway South, drive them to secluded areas, and then strangle them during or after sexual activity. He would then dispose of their bodies in remote locations, often returning later to move them if he felt they might be discovered. Ridgway admitted that he had sometimes engaged in necrophilia with his victims and had kept personal items from some of them as trophies. What was most disturbing about Ridgway's confessions was his matter-of-fact demeanor. He spoke about his crimes with the same tone someone might use to describe their daily routine, showing no emotion or remorse for the suffering he had caused. When investigators asked him about specific victims, he often couldn't remember their names or distinguish between different murders. Ridgway explained that he had specifically targeted prostitutes because he knew they would not be missed immediately and because he felt they deserved to die. He harbored deep resentment toward women in general, particularly those who he perceived as promiscuous or immoral. His marriages had all been troubled, and he had a history of controlling and manipulative behavior toward women. The confessions also revealed the true scope of Ridgway's crimes. While he was initially charged with 48 murders, he admitted that the actual number was probably higher. Some victims had been buried or disposed of in locations where their bodies would never be found, while others might have been misidentified or attributed to other killers. Ridgway estimated that he had killed at least 60 women, and possibly as many as 80. During the confession process, Ridgway also provided information that helped investigators locate additional victims. He led them to remote areas where he had disposed of bodies, sometimes decades after the murders. In several cases, his information led to the discovery of remains that had never been found, providing closure for families who had spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. One of the most important aspects of Ridgway's confessions was his explanation of how he had evaded capture for so long. He revealed that he had been extremely careful about avoiding detection, varying his methods and disposal sites to prevent investigators from establishing patterns. He had also deliberately chosen victims who lived high-risk lifestyles, knowing that their disappearances might not be investigated as thoroughly as those of other citizens. Ridgway admitted that he had been aware of the Green River Task Force investigation from its earliest days and had modified his behavior in response to law enforcement activities. When he noticed increased police presence in certain areas, he would move his hunting grounds. When he learned about forensic techniques being used in the investigation, he became more careful about leaving physical evidence. On December 18, 2003, Gary Ridgway appeared in King County Superior Court for his sentencing hearing. The courtroom was packed with family members of his victims, investigators who had worked on the case, and members of the media who had followed the story for more than 20 years. It was a moment that many people had thought would never come. Judge Richard Jones presided over the hearing, which lasted for 2 full days. The first day was devoted to victim impact statements, during which family members were given the opportunity to address Ridgway directly and tell him about the impact his crimes had had on their lives. The statements were heartbreaking and powerful, providing a human face to the statistics and case files that had defined the investigation. Mary Bridget Meehan, the mother of victim Mary Meehan, told Ridgway, "You took my daughter's life and for that I will never forgive you. But I want you to know that she was loved, and she mattered, and her life had value." Other family members spoke about the years of uncertainty they had endured, not knowing whether their daughters were alive or dead, and the impact that the murders had had on their relationships and mental health. Throughout the victim impact statements, Ridgway sat quietly at the defense table, showing little emotion. Occasionally he would look up at the speakers, but for the most part he stared down at his hands or at the table in front of him. His lack of visible remorse was noted by many observers and seemed to underscore the cold, calculating nature of his crimes. On the second day of the hearing, Judge Jones imposed Ridgway's sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The judge also sentenced him to an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence. In total, Ridgway would spend the rest of his life in prison with no possibility of release. In his remarks before imposing the sentence, Judge Jones noted the unprecedented nature of the case and the impact it had had on the community. He praised the investigators who had worked tirelessly to solve the murders and the families who had never given up hope for justice. He also acknowledged the significance of the plea agreement, which had provided closure for families while avoiding the uncertainties of a death penalty trial. Dave Reichert, who had been promoted to King County Sheriff, spoke to the media after the sentencing. He expressed satisfaction that justice had finally been served, but also noted that the case had taken a tremendous toll on everyone involved. He dedicated the successful resolution of the case to the memory of the victims and to their families, who had waited so long for answers. The Green River case had several lasting impacts on law enforcement and criminal justice. It demonstrated the importance of DNA technology in solving cold cases and led to increased investment in forensic laboratories and training. It also highlighted the need for better coordination between different law enforcement agencies and the value of maintaining dedicated investigative teams for complex serial crime cases. Perhaps most importantly, the case changed how law enforcement agencies approach investigations involving marginalized victims. The respectful treatment that Dave Reichert and his team showed to the women working on the Strip became a model for other departments, demonstrating that all victims deserve thorough investigation regardless of their lifestyle or circumstances. Gary Ridgway is now serving his life sentence at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he will remain until his death. He is housed in protective custody for his own safety, as inmates convicted of crimes against women and children are often targeted by other prisoners. He spends most of his time alone in his cell, with limited contact with other inmates or the outside world. In the years since his conviction, Ridgway has occasionally provided additional information to investigators about unsolved cases, but he has never expressed genuine remorse for his crimes. Prison officials describe him as a model prisoner who follows rules and causes no trouble, but psychological evaluations continue to show that he lacks empathy and remains potentially dangerous. The families of Ridgway's victims have had varied responses to his conviction and imprisonment. Some have found peace in knowing that justice was served and that he will never hurt anyone else. Others continue to struggle with anger and grief, feeling that no punishment could truly balance the scales for the loss of their loved ones. Many have become advocates for victims' rights and have worked to improve support services for families affected by violent crime. Detective Dave Reichert served as King County Sheriff until 2005, when he was elected to the United States House of Representatives. Throughout his political career, he continued to speak about the Green River case and its impact on his life and career. He authored a book about the investigation and has remained in contact with many of the victims' families. The case also led to significant changes in how missing persons cases are handled, particularly those involving marginalized populations. Law enforcement agencies have implemented new protocols for investigating disappearances of sex workers, runaways, and other vulnerable individuals. There is greater recognition that these cases deserve the same level of attention and resources as cases involving more conventional victims. Today, the Green River case is studied in criminal justice programs around the world as an example of how persistence, technology, and good police work can solve even the most challenging cases. It serves as a reminder that no case is truly hopeless, and that advances in forensic science can bring justice even decades after crimes are committed. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Green River case is the way it honored the memory of the victims. These were young women whose lives had value and meaning, who were loved by their families and friends, and who deserved justice. The investigators who worked on this case never forgot that truth, and their dedication ultimately ensured that Gary Ridgway would answer for his crimes. The Green River runs quietly through Washington state today, its waters carrying no trace of the horrors that once stained its banks. But the memory of the women who died there lives on, a testament to the importance of never giving up in the pursuit of justice and the fundamental truth that every life has value, regardless of the circumstances in which it is lived. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.